There's a photograph in my wallet. It's been there so long the edges have gone soft, the way photographs do when they live in a back pocket for years. It's of my wife Sian standing outside our house in Tredegar. This would be maybe 15 years ago, squinting into the sun with her arms folded, and that expression she gets when she's pretending not to smile. I look at it sometimes when I'm on a job, sitting in the van eating a sandwich, and I think about how ordinary it is, that photograph, how completely solidly ordinary. I look at it differently now. Since last March, I look at it, and I think about how much it would have cost someone, what the going rate is, apparently, for a woman standing outside her house in the sun, not knowing she's being looked at. I'll get to that. My name is Gareth. I'm 54 years old. I've been a plumber for 30 years, self-employed for the last 22, working mostly residential across Blaenau Gwent and up into the valleys. I know this part of Wales the way you know somewhere you've worked every corner of, not the postcard version, not the valleys and chapels version that people imagine when you tell them where you're from, but the actual version. The houses with the boilers that haven't been serviced in a decade. The council estates where the pipework is original and holds together mostly through stubbornness. The farms up on the ridgeline, where in winter the ground freezes hard and the pipes go with it, and you drive up there in the dark because a family has no water, and the wind off the beacons is the kind of cold that lives inside you for the rest of the day. I like the work. That's not something I've said to many people because it sounds like the kind of thing you're supposed to say, but it's true. There's a satisfaction to it that I haven't found in much else. A problem that has a solution you can find with your hands, an outcome you can test. Either the water runs or it doesn't. I find that straightforward quality restful, which probably tells you something about the rest of my life. Sian and I have been married for 26 years. We have 2 daughters, both grown, one in Cardiff and one in Bristol. We live in the house we bought when Megan, the eldest, was small. Semi-detached, good-sized garden, on the edge of town where it starts to feel like somewhere rather than nowhere. It's not a dramatic life. It's a good one. Was a good one. Still is, I suppose technically, in the sense that we're both alive and the house is still standing and my daughters still ring on Sundays. But the word good has changed shape since March, and I'm not sure it'll go back. The job that started it was straightforward. Emergency call-out, bathroom in a house on the edge of Ebb Vale, burst pipe behind the boxing around the bath. The householder was a man in his 60s, Barry, who I'd done work for before. Good customer, paid promptly, made decent tea. He let me in, showed me the problem, and went to sit in the kitchen out of the way, which is what sensible customers do. I had the boxing off inside 10 minutes. Pipe split clean along a weld, old copper, the kind of thing that goes eventually in houses this age. Standard repair. While I was working, I had Radio Wales on low through my phone, not really listening, just background. Barry came in at one point, offered more tea, mentioned something about his internet being slow, asked if I knew anything about routers. I said not really, plumber not an electrician, but I had a look on my way to rinse my hands and noticed his laptop open on the kitchen table, screen facing me as I passed. I wasn't looking at it. I want to be straight about that. I wasn't snooping, wasn't curious about what he had on there. But the screen was there and I glanced at it and my brain registered what was on it before I could choose not to see it. It was a forum. Dark background, lots of text, and in large enough type that I caught it clearly in a glance, a thread title, and below it a partial line of text. The thread title was a location. The partial text below it was a price, both registered. Neither meant anything to me at that moment. I went and rinsed my hands and finished the job and drove to the next call out. That was a Tuesday in November. November to March. That's how long it took. It took that long because I didn't connect what I'd seen to anything. A forum, a location, a price. So what? The internet is full of forums about everything. People buy and sell things online. I filed it away as nothing and forgot about it more or less. More or less. The location had been Tredegar. I live in Tredegar. There are, I don't know, a few thousand people in Tredegar. A location is not a person. I told myself that in the occasional moments when what I'd seen surfaced, and I let myself think about it briefly before putting it back down. A location is not a name. It's nothing. Barry rang me in February. Boiler service. Annual reminder I sent out to regular customers. I went back to the house on a Thursday morning, did the service, drank the tea. The laptop wasn't on the table this time. Everything was normal. He was, as far as I could tell, exactly what he'd always been. A retired man, living alone, reasonable, polite, not someone you'd look at twice. That's the thing about people, isn't it? You can work in someone's house, drink their tea, know them for years across a series of jobs, and know almost nothing about them. I know more about the pipe runs in Barry's house than I know about Barry. I know where his stop valve is and how old his boiler is and what the water pressure runs at. I know nothing about what he does at that kitchen table in the evenings. I drove home on the Thursday afternoon, and for some reason I didn't put it back down this time. The fragment I'd seen in November sat in my head and wouldn't move, and on an impulse, I still don't fully understand, I mentioned it to Cian over dinner. Not the forum, not the specifics. Just that I'd been back to Barry's. Just that I had an odd feeling I couldn't account for. She asked what kind of odd feeling. I said I didn't know. We talked about something else, but she pulled her cardigan a bit tighter, the way she does when something bothers her. And later that evening, I sat in the kitchen after she'd gone up, and I thought about what I'd actually seen. A dark forum, a location, a price. And below the price, one more thing I'd half processed, and then not thought about since November. Below the price there had been a small amount of additional text. I hadn't read it consciously, but the brain keeps things, files them away whether you ask it to or not. And sitting in the kitchen in February, I understood that I had retained more than I'd acknowledged. Below the price, the text had included a description. Female, 40s, specific street, our street. I need to be careful here about what I'm saying, and I'm aware I need to be careful, because the alternative is something I can't sustain and still function. What I saw in November was a fragment, a glance. I am not a man who makes dramatic leaps. I'm a plumber. I deal in what's in front of me, what I can touch and test and verify. Leaping to a conclusion on the basis of a partial line of text seen on someone else's screen for 2 seconds is not how I operate. But female, 40s, specific street, location, Tredegar. Cian is 49. We live on that street. There is no version of these facts that I can arrange into a comfortable shape. I went back to the forum. That sentence sounds straightforward, and it wasn't. I don't know my way around that side of things. I'm not someone who explores the internet much beyond what the job requires, but I knew enough to find it, eventually, through a process I won't explain in detail. And when I found it, I wished I hadn't. It was a marketplace. That's the cleanest word for it. A forum structured around the buying and selling of violence. Not weapons, not threats. Violence as a service. Specific, directed, contracted, delivered. The listings were organized by location, by specification, by price. They were discussed in the threads with the matter-of-fact language of people who have been doing this long enough that the horror has become routine. Availability, timelines, methods. The threads about completed jobs were the worst, brief, confirmatory. The kind of language you'd use to confirm a delivery had arrived, which is, when you think about it, exactly what they were. I found the Tredegar thread. I found the listing. I read it completely this time, not a glance, not a fragment. The description was seen. I am not making a leap. I am telling you that the thread contained details that were not publicly available. Details about her routine, about the layout of our house, about the times she was likely to be alone. Someone had done preparatory work. The thread was active. The listing had been up, based on the thread dates, for about 3 weeks when I first saw it in November. It had continued to be active since then. There had been at least 2 expressions of interest from other users in the period between November and February. No confirmed contract. Not yet. I sat in my van for 40 minutes reading that thread. The wind off the beacons was doing what it does. I'm going to tell you what I felt because I said I'd be honest. It wasn't panic. Not quite. It was something colder and more specific. A focused, precise fury that I'm aware has not left me and which I manage daily by concentrating on facts and on what I can actually do rather than on what I want to do, which I'll leave to your imagination. I went to the police that same day, Thursday evening, Tredegar Station. A conversation that was at first difficult to have coherently and then became more coherent as I forced myself to slow down and report facts in order. The officer I spoke to was young, did her best, took notes. Within an hour, I was talking to someone from a specialist unit over the phone. Within 2 hours, there were people at my house. Cian didn't know the full detail that night. I'm not sure I made the right call with that. She knew something was wrong, obviously. Police in the house make it fairly clear that something is wrong. And I told her there was a threat that was being taken seriously and that she was safe. She accepted that with the composure she's always had, which I rely on more than I've ever told her. I sat with her until she slept, and then I sat in the kitchen again for most of the rest of the night. The investigation is still ongoing. Barry, and I'll say this plainly because I've earned the right to say it plainly, Barry was identified early in the process as connected to the forum. Whether he placed the listing or shared it, or was simply a member who'd engaged with it, I don't know and haven't been told in terms I can be certain about. What I've been told is that the investigation is complex, that these things take time, and that the threat to Cian has been assessed and addressed. She knows now, all of it. We've talked about it more times than I can count, and not talked about it on the days when talking about it isn't possible. She's handling it the way she handles most things, which is by continuing to get up in the morning and do what needs doing, and I'm trying to do the same. The photograph in my wallet. Cian outside the house, squinting, pretending not to smile. I didn't put it there thinking about it. It's just always been there, the way things accumulate in a wallet over years without you choosing them exactly. But I look at it differently now. Someone compiled a description of my wife, researched her, listed her, attached a price. I don't know who that someone is beyond Barry's connection. I don't know why. There are scenarios the police have suggested but not confirmed, and I've tried not to construct more of my own because I'm aware that once you start building that kind of story in your head, it's hard to stop. I have 30 years of knowing how things work. Pipes, boilers, systems. You trace the problem back to where it started. You fix it properly. You test it. You move on. That's what I know how to do. This I don't know how to fix. That's the part I haven't told anyone, not even Cian. There is no fixing it. There's managing it. There's the investigation. There's the ongoing assessment and the police contacts and the process. But the thing that was true when I read that thread in my van with the wind off the beacons is still true. and no investigation changes it. Someone looked at my wife and decided she had a value, and the value was a price on a screen on a dark forum, and I drove to her house every day for 26 years without knowing that was a thing that could happen. Barry made decent tea. His boiler runs fine. His stop valve is under the kitchen sink. Copper isolation, original to the house. I know where he lives. I'm not going to do anything with that. I want to be clear. I'm saying it because it's true, and the truth of it is part of the account, and leaving it out would make the account dishonest. The thought is there. It sits where it sits, and every morning I get up and I look at what's actually in front of me, which is my wife, alive, making coffee in our kitchen, and I make the same decision again. So far, that's been enough. So far. I won something once, or at least I thought I had. It was one of those online competitions you enter without really expecting anything to come of it. The sort where you provide your email address and answer a few questions for a chance at winning a holiday or a voucher. I can't even remember now which competition it was specifically, just that I'd entered several around the same time, and one of them had apparently selected me as a winner. That moment of unexpected good luck is the reason I now sleep with my curtains drawn, my phone on silent, and a growing sense that I'm being watched in ways I'll never fully understand. I'm a hairdresser working at a salon in Leicester. Been there for around 8 years now. It's a good job, steady clientele. The kind of work where you get to know people over time through their regular appointments. I rent a small flat above a chip shop on a busy road near the city centre. Nothing fancy, but it's affordable and convenient for getting to work. I live alone. Always have preferred it that way, though that independence feels more like vulnerability now. The email about winning the competition arrived on a Saturday morning last spring. I'd been entering various online competitions for months, mostly out of boredom during quiet evenings at home. Gift vouchers, spa days, weekend breaks, the kind of prizes that seemed appealing but unlikely. The email said I'd won a luxury hamper worth around £300, filled with premium foods and wines, and I just needed to confirm my delivery details. The message looked legitimate enough. Professional formatting, a logo I vaguely recognized from one of the competition websites I'd visited, congratulatory language that seemed genuine. It asked me to click a link to verify my details and select a delivery date. I did exactly that, pleased with my unexpected luck and already mentally planning who I'd share the hamper contents with. The verification form asked for standard delivery information. My full name and address, obviously, but also a phone number in case the courier needed to contact me. Then it asked about my availability for delivery, wanting to know which days I typically worked, what hours I was usually home, whether I had neighbors who could accept packages on my behalf. It explained that the hamper contained perishable items and needed to be delivered when someone would definitely be available to receive it. I provided all the information requested. My work schedule at the salon, the fact that I worked Tuesday through Saturday, that I was usually home by 7 in the evening on work days and all day Sunday and Monday. I mentioned I didn't really know my neighbors well enough to have them accept deliveries, and that the best time would be Sunday afternoon when I was definitely home. The form also asked about dietary restrictions and preferences, supposedly so they could tailor the hamper contents appropriately. I answered those questions too, noting that I was vegetarian, that I didn't drink red wine, that I had a mild allergy to nuts. It seemed like good customer service, making sure the prize would actually be something I could enjoy, rather than a generic selection. A confirmation email arrived within minutes, thanking me for providing my details and saying the hamper would be delivered within 2 weeks. I felt satisfied and lucky, the small rush of pleasure that comes from winning something unexpected, even if it wasn't life-changing. The hamper never arrived. After 3 weeks, I tried to follow up using the email address from the original message, but my emails bounced back as undeliverable. I searched for the competition website I thought I'd entered, but I couldn't find it anymore. I checked my browser history, but I'd entered so many different competitions that I couldn't identify which specific one had supposedly selected me as a winner. I eventually accepted that it had probably been a scam, annoyed with myself for falling for it, but assuming the worst consequence would be some spam emails. I hadn't provided bank details or anything that could be used for direct financial fraud, just delivery information and personal preferences. It seemed like an elaborate scam for relatively minimal payoff, but I figured the scammers had probably sent the same email to thousands of people hoping to collect data they could sell to marketing companies. About a month later, I started noticing a car parked on my street that I didn't recognize. A dark blue Vauxhall, usually parked a few spaces down from my building, often there when I left for work and still there when I returned. I didn't think much of it initially. Parking on my street was always competitive, and residents often left cars in the same spots for days at a time. Then I started seeing the same car in other locations, parked near the salon where I worked, visible from the window where I spent most of my day cutting hair, parked outside the supermarket I usually shopped at on Sunday mornings, parked near the bus stop I used when visiting my mum across town. The same dark blue Vauxhall, or at least what appeared to be the same one, showing up in too many places to be coincidental. I tried to get a look at the driver, but the windows were tinted enough that I could only make out vague shapes inside. I never saw anyone get in or out of the car, never caught a clear view of who was driving. It was just there, persistently present in locations where I spent time, watching without ever doing anything overtly threatening. I reported it to the police, explaining that I believed someone was following me. They took a statement and said they'd increase patrols in my area, but they were honest about how difficult it was to act on these situations. Following someone wasn't itself illegal unless it crossed into harassment or stalking territory, and I didn't have evidence of threats or direct contact. They took down the registration number I'd managed to note, but when they checked it, the car was registered to a leasing company with multiple vehicles on their fleet. Tracing who was actually driving at any given time would be nearly impossible. The car eventually stopped appearing, or at least I stopped noticing it after a few weeks. I told myself I'd been paranoid, that it was probably someone who happened to live and work in similar areas to me, that the pattern I'd seen was just coincidence amplified by anxiety. Then other things started happening, small things at first, easy to dismiss individually, but forming a pattern that became harder to ignore. I'd find my rubbish bin moved from where I'd left it, positioned differently than I remembered. The position of my doormat would be slightly off, as though someone had lifted it and replaced it carelessly. Once I found a cigarette stub near my door, even though I didn't smoke and neither did any of my neighbors as far as I knew. Inside my flat, I'd noticed minor changes that could have been my own forgetfulness, but felt wrong. A kitchen cupboard left slightly ajar when I was certain I'd closed it. A book moved on my shelf, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it wasn't where I'd last placed it. My bathroom window left unlatched when I always kept it locked. I started documenting these incidents, taking photos of how I left things so I could compare them when I returned. The documentation confirmed I wasn't imagining it. Things were being moved, adjusted, interfered with, while I was out. Someone had access to my flat, entering and leaving without forcing locks or breaking windows, just subtle enough that each individual incident could be explained away as forgetfulness or accident. I had my locks changed, installed a chain on the door, checked all the windows obsessively before leaving. The disturbances continued. A drawer in my bedroom would be open slightly. A coat in my wardrobe would be hanging differently than I'd left it. My toothbrush would be in a different position on the sink. What made it more disturbing was that nothing was ever stolen or damaged. Whoever was entering my flat wasn't taking anything or leaving obvious evidence of their presence. They were just moving through my space, touching my belongings, making their presence known in the smallest possible ways. It felt like psychological warfare, designed to make me question my own perception and feel unsafe in my own home. I installed a small camera in my living room, one of those basic security cameras that connects to your phone and records when it detects movement. The first few days showed nothing unusual, just me moving around the flat going about my normal routine. Then on the fourth day, whilst I was at work, the camera captured someone entering my flat. The figure was dressed in dark clothes and wore a balaclava that completely obscured their face. They moved through my flat systematically, not looking for valuables to steal, but appearing to document everything. They opened drawers and cupboards, looked through papers on my desk, examined items on my shelves. They spent several minutes in my bedroom, going through my wardrobe and checking under my bed. The whole intrusion lasted about 40 minutes before they left as silently as they'd entered. Most disturbing was what they did at the end. They walked directly to where the camera was positioned, despite it being small and relatively well hidden. They stood there for several long seconds, staring directly into the lens, letting me know they were aware of being recorded and weren't concerned about it. Then they reached up and adjusted the camera angle slightly before leaving. A small violation that made it clear they could access my flat whenever they wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I took the footage to the police immediately. They treated it more seriously this time, with actual evidence of someone illegally entering my home. But the figure in the video was completely unidentifiable, and they'd been careful not to touch anything that might leave fingerprints. The police arranged for forensics to check my flat, but they found nothing useful. Whoever was entering knew how to avoid leaving evidence. A detective assigned to my case asked if I'd recently signed up for any online services or provided personal information to anyone I didn't know well. I mentioned the competition email from months earlier, though I didn't see how that could be connected. She asked if I still had the email, and when I showed it to her, her expression changed. She explained that these fake competition emails were being used to gather detailed information about people's routines and living situations. The questions about work schedules, availability times, living alone, dietary preferences, none of it was about delivering a hamper. It was intelligence gathering, creating profiles of potential targets who could be monitored and accessed. The detective showed me how to access a dark web marketplace where these profiles were being sold. My information was listed there, complete with everything I'd provided on that verification form, and additional details that had apparently been gathered through surveillance. My work schedule, the fact that I lived alone, my regular shopping times, even my recent habit of visiting my mum on Sunday afternoons, all documented, analyzed and made available for purchase. The listing described me as an ideal target for what they called residential access services. People could purchase rights to enter my flat during specific time windows when I was reliably away. The profile explained that locks had been bypassed using specialized tools, that the flat had minimal security, that entry and exit could be accomplished without alerting neighbors or authorities. But it wasn't just about burglary. The listing mentioned that the flat had been accessed multiple times already for photography and documentation purposes. There were buyers interested in detailed images of someone's private living space, in being able to study how a person organized their belongings, in having visual access to intimate details of a stranger's life. The marketplace showed my profile had been purchased multiple times by different users. Some had bought access for physical entry, which explained the person caught on my camera. Others had purchased photographic documentation, which meant images of my private space existed somewhere I'd never find them. The listing was still active, still accepting new purchases, still describing my flat as available for access. Comments beneath my listing discussed the quality of access and the accuracy of the timing information. Previous buyers had left feedback rating their experience, mentioning that my routine was reliable and that entry was straightforward. One comment noted that I'd installed a camera which had been easily managed during their visit. Another comment discussed specific items in my bedroom, describing my belongings in detail, that suggested they'd spent considerable time examining my personal space. The police investigation eventually identified the person who'd created my profile, someone who'd sent thousands of fake competition emails and collected information from hundreds of respondents. They were prosecuted for fraud and other offenses, but the marketplace itself continued operating, and the profiles that had already been created remained accessible. My information was still there, marked as potentially compromised, but still available for reference. I moved out of that flat within weeks of discovering the marketplace. I couldn't stay somewhere that had been so thoroughly violated, that multiple strangers had accessed and photographed while I was away. My new place has serious security, proper locks, multiple cameras, alarm system, the works. I'm hyper-vigilant about any requests for personal information, no matter how innocent they seem. But I know the profile still exists somewhere online. My old address, my routine from that period, images of my former living space that strangers can still view and study. The listing has been updated to note that I've moved, but the historical information remains accessible, permanently archived in spaces I can't reach or control. What haunts me most is thinking about all the other people who received similar competition emails and filled out verification forms, never realizing what they were actually providing. The detective told me thousands of these profiles had been created across the UK, targeting people who lived alone, who had predictable routines, who seemed vulnerable in ways that made their living spaces attractive to buyers on these dark web marketplaces. I still see marketing emails sometimes about competitions and prize draws, and I wonder how many are legitimate and how many are intelligence gathering operations. Every request for personal information makes me suspicious now. Every form that asks about my schedule or living situation raises red flags that most people would never notice. The person caught on my camera was never identified. The police believe they were hired specifically to enter my flat and document it. Probably someone who'd purchased access through that marketplace and decided to verify the information they'd bought. They might have been planning something more serious, or they might have just been satisfied with the intrusion itself, the violation of entering someone's private space without their knowledge. I'll never know how many times my flat was accessed before I installed the camera. How many strangers walked through my rooms, examined my belongings, photographed my space while I was at work or visiting my mum. The camera only caught one person, but the marketplace comments suggested there had been multiple successful entries by different buyers over several months. That's what I think about now when I'm alone in my new flat, despite all the security measures I've installed. The knowledge that somewhere online, detailed information about my life is still available for purchase. That images of my former bedroom, my wardrobe, my personal belongings exist in private collections I'll never locate. That I enabled all of it by entering a competition I can't even remember, by filling out a verification form that seemed completely harmless. I won something once, or thought I had. What I actually won was a permanent place in a dark web marketplace, a profile describing my vulnerabilities and routines, and the knowledge that my privacy was systematically violated by people I'll never identify. All from answering a few questions about a hamper I was never going to receive. The competition was fake, but the consequences were real. That's what keeps me careful now, questioning everything, trusting nothing that seems too good to be true, because I learned the hard way that sometimes the cost of free entry is everything you thought was private, documented, and sold to strangers who view your life as a commodity worth purchasing. Do you ever rehearse something in your head before you say it, just to get an idea of how it'll sound? I did that with this story. It probably sounds like a strange way to begin, but there's a reason. I can't bring myself to properly clean my own house anymore. Every time I pick up a cloth or switch on the Hoover, I think about the things I found hidden inside other people's homes, and I start to wonder what might be buried in mine. What seemed like straightforward work ended up showing me how fragile privacy really is. The whole thing started when I answered an advertisement for domestic cleaning work in Stoke-on-Trent. I had been struggling to find steady employment after the care home where I worked closed down due to funding issues. The redundancy package had barely lasted 2 months, and I was facing the prospect of losing my flat if I couldn't find regular income soon. The cleaning job seemed ideal for my circumstances. The agency advertised flexible hours, above average pay, and the opportunity to work independently without constant supervision. They emphasized that they served a discerning clientele who valued discretion and reliability above all else. During the interview, the agency manager explained that their clients were typically busy professionals who traveled frequently for work. Many of their properties required maintenance cleaning while the owners were abroad, ensuring that homes remained pristine and secure during extended absences. The manager stressed that absolute discretion was essential for this type of work. Clients needed to trust that their homes would be treated with complete respect, and that any personal information encountered during cleaning would remain strictly confidential. She made it clear that discussing clients or their homes with anyone outside the agency would result in immediate termination. I was assigned to a rotation of about 6 different properties across Staffordshire and the West Midlands. All were substantial homes owned by people who apparently travelled extensively for business. The agency provided detailed cleaning schedules and specific instructions for each property, along with keys and alarm codes for access. The first few properties I cleaned were exactly as advertised. Well-maintained homes that showed signs of recent occupation, but were temporarily vacant while the owners travelled. The cleaning work was thorough but straightforward, focusing on maintaining the properties in pristine condition for the owner's return. However, I began noticing unusual aspects of these homes that didn't quite fit the profile of busy travelling professionals. Many contained personal belongings and living arrangements that suggested the owners had left suddenly rather than departing for planned business trips. Some properties had half-eaten meals still on tables, unopened mail accumulating by the front door, and cars parked in driveways that appeared to have been sitting unused for weeks. The homes felt abandoned rather than temporarily vacant, as if the occupants had simply vanished without making proper arrangements for their absence. When I mentioned these observations to the agency manager, she explained that many of their clients worked in high-stress industries where travel plans could change rapidly. Emergency business trips often required immediate departure, leaving little time for proper household arrangements. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for the apparent haste with which some clients had departed their homes. International business often involved urgent situations that required dropping everything to respond to crises or opportunities abroad. However, as I continued working for the agency, I noticed that the cleaning assignments involved tasks that went beyond typical domestic maintenance. I was asked to organize personal documents, inventory valuable items, and photograph certain rooms and belongings for what the agency described as insurance and security purposes. These additional responsibilities felt intrusive and unnecessary for basic cleaning services. When I questioned why document organization and property photography were required, the agency explained that their clients often needed assistance managing their affairs during extended absences. Many clients were elderly or had complex financial arrangements that required careful monitoring, while they were unable to oversee their properties personally. The agency provided comprehensive property management services that went beyond simple cleaning to include basic administrative support. This explanation seemed plausible for legitimate property management work, but the specific documents and items I was asked to photograph suggested interest that went beyond administrative assistance. I was documenting personal correspondence, financial records, and intimate family photographs that seemed irrelevant to property security. The agency began requesting more detailed reports about each property, including information about the personal lives and circumstances of the homeowners based on what I observed during cleaning. They wanted to know about medication schedules, social relationships, and lifestyle patterns that could be determined from examining personal belongings. When I expressed discomfort with gathering such intimate information about the homeowners, the agency reminded me that understanding client circumstances was essential for providing appropriate property management services. Elderly or vulnerable clients often needed additional support that required awareness of their personal situations. Around the 6th week of my employment with the agency, I was assigned to clean a property that belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson. Unlike the other homes on my route, this property showed clear signs that the owner had not left voluntarily for business travel. The house contained evidence of a struggle, with furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered, and signs that someone had been searching through drawers and cabinets. The home felt like a crime scene, rather than a property requiring maintenance cleaning while the owner traveled. When I contacted the agency about the condition of Mrs. Henderson's home, they explained that she had suffered a medical emergency while preparing for a trip and had been hospitalized. The family had asked for emergency cleaning services to secure the property while they dealt with the medical crisis. This explanation seemed reasonable enough, but I was troubled by the specific cleaning instructions for Mrs. Henderson's property. Instead of focusing on tidying up after the medical emergency, I was asked to photograph all personal documents, inventory jewelry and valuables, and document any information about bank accounts or financial arrangements. These tasks felt more like systematic robbery than cleaning services for a family dealing with a medical emergency. I was essentially cataloging everything of value in the home and documenting personal information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. When I tried to refuse these expanded responsibilities, the agency pointed out that I had already been gathering similar information from other properties for several weeks. They reminded me that I had signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements that covered all aspects of the property management services I was providing. They also mentioned that I had gained access to sensitive information about multiple clients and their personal circumstances. This knowledge made me a valuable part of their operation, but it also meant that ending my employment would require careful consideration of security implications. The agency began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our employment relationship. They made references to my financial difficulties, housing situation, and daily routine that suggested they had been conducting background research into my own life. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my activities and communications were being monitored. The agency was applying the same intelligence gathering techniques to my personal life that I had been using to gather information about their clients' circumstances. I realized that the cleaning work had been used to recruit me into systematic burglary and identity theft operations disguised as property management services. The homes I had been cleaning belonged to vulnerable people who had been targeted for exploitation, and I had been gathering the intelligence needed to rob them systematically. The properties weren't owned by traveling business professionals at all. They belonged to elderly or vulnerable people who had been removed from their homes through various means, allowing the agency to access their properties and personal information without interference. Mrs. Henderson's case was probably typical of how the operation worked. Vulnerable people were identified and their circumstances manipulated to create opportunities for accessing their homes and gathering information about their assets and personal lives. When I attempted to report my suspicions to the police, I discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The cleaning work had been presented as legitimate property management services. The confidentiality agreements I had signed covered various types of administrative assistance, and the personal information I had gathered could be justified as necessary for proper client care. The agency had structured their operations to make the systematic robbery and identity theft appear like legitimate property management work. Proving criminal intent would require evidence that went beyond what I could provide based on my limited knowledge of their overall operations. The agency continued to contact me for several months after I stopped working for them, offering additional cleaning assignments and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined the full scope of their operations or what happened to the people whose homes I had been systematically cataloging. The combination of property access, personal intelligence gathering, and sophisticated methods for targeting vulnerable individuals suggested an organization capable of extensive financial and personal exploitation. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting people into criminal operations by presenting theft and fraud as legitimate employment opportunities. They understood how to exploit financial desperation to recruit accomplices who would provide detailed intelligence about potential victims' assets and vulnerabilities. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire for steady employment had been transformed into participation in systematic victimization of vulnerable people. The cleaning work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people desperate enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for regular income. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar property management companies, offering cleaning and administrative work that pays well for what appears to be basic domestic services. The positions they advertise always involve working with elderly or traveling clients, always require strict confidentiality, and always include responsibilities that go beyond typical cleaning work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate property management services while actually participating in systematic robbery and exploitation of vulnerable homeowners. A first time I saw my own front door on someone else's screen, it was buried a few clicks deep into a part of the internet most people prefer to pretend is just an urban myth. I should start before that, otherwise it sounds like I am jumping to the end to make it dramatic. I did not grow up wanting to explore hidden parts of anything. I grew up on a tired council estate outside Birmingham, in a flat where the walls carried other people's arguments, kids crying and televisions you could follow through plaster. The family laptop sat on a wobbly little table in the living room, and it became the one thing that felt mine. Headphones on, brightness turned down, noise shrunk into a small square of light. At first it was harmless. Clips, music, stupid comedy videos. Then the recommendations shifted. Short CCTV compilations, doorbell camera footage, titles about burglars caught on camera, home intruders chased off, people trying door handles on quiet streets. At the start, I told myself it was educational in a way. You see how break-ins actually happen, instead of just hearing about them. A lot of those videos were fake. You could tell when the acting was too neat, when angles changed in ways real security cameras never would. But enough of them were real that it hooked me. You saw ordinary houses, ordinary people, and then one night something went wrong. I was not enjoying other people's fear. At least, that was what I told myself. I just wanted to see what danger looked like when it arrived without warning in a place that could have been ours. Years drifted by. I left school with average grades and got a job in a small warehouse near Digbeth. Normal hours, basic pay, nothing that would impress anyone. Eventually, I moved into a small flat above a row of shops on the edge of the city centre. My life settled into a pattern that felt fine on the surface. Work, walk home, heat something up, sit on the sagging sofa with the laptop balanced on my legs. Other people put on box sets or football when they wanted to switch off. I put on shaky footage of late-night break-ins. The trouble with watching that kind of thing for years is that you get desensitized. The clips on normal sites started to feel processed. The same soundtracks kept cropping up. Comment sections were full of people arguing about which ones were staged. I could see where edits had been made to make things seem worse than they were. The part of me that wanted something real began to notice how fake it all looked. The phrase dark web popped up now and then in conversations at work. Blokes by the loading bay repeating half-remembered stories about a place online where you could buy anything, hire anyone, see things too heavy for the normal internet. It was always delivered with a laugh, like they were not completely sure it existed. I did not rush off home and start digging. The idea just lodged itself somewhere in the back of my head, the way an odd door at the end of a hallway sticks in your mind, even when you never touch the handle. What finally pushed me was not anything dramatic. It was boredom. One night, I was scrolling through a long thread about missing people, hidden security footage type stuff. Deep in there, buried between stupid comments, someone mentioned a site that streamed live footage from unsecured cameras inside people's houses, not celebrities. Not people who had agreed to it, just normal homes someone had accidentally exposed. The person wrote that if you watched long enough, something always happened eventually. The way they said it was almost casual. That bothered me more than anything. I tried to forget it. I went back to my usual habits. But every time I watched some old clip of a man trying a back door or a teenager creeping through a garden, the thought floated up again. Somewhere, right now, someone might be watching a live hallway instead of a recording, waiting for the moment things tipped. Eventually, I found a way into that side of the internet. I am not going to explain how. You can piece it together if you really want, but if you have any sense, you will let the steps stay blurry. All that matters is that one evening, with the sky outside my windows turning orange and then black, I ended up on a page that was clearly not meant for the average user. It looked dull. No logos, no animations, no adverts. Just a pale background, a list of locations described in vague terms, and beside some of them, tiny video windows. The descriptions were deliberately unspecific. Terrace in a city, detached house in a village, flat in a tower block. Enough that you could imagine the place, not enough to identify it. A short line at the top claimed all the cameras were already exposed elsewhere, that nothing here involved breaking in or planting devices. It said the feeds were taken from things people had left open. That little sentence was enough for me to tell myself I was not crossing a line. I was only looking where someone careless had already left the door wide open. I clicked on one of the feeds. A living room appeared. The camera was mounted high up near the ceiling, looking down on a sofa, a television stand, a coffee table with an empty mug and remote on it. The room was empty. After a minute or two, a woman wandered in, dropped a bag, scrolled through her phone, and then flopped onto the sofa in that way you never do if you think anyone is watching you. Nothing happened. She did not get attacked. No masked figure appeared. She just watched television, scratched her leg, and eventually went to get a drink. It was painfully ordinary. I clicked away, then back, then tried a different feed. A kitchen, empty. A nursery, thankfully empty too. A hallway in a narrow house with a front door and staircase. The camera tucked up in one corner, so it saw almost everything in that small, cramped space. That hallway ended up being the one I kept returning to. You could tell it was somewhere in the UK from the style of the door and the switches. Coats hung thick on a rack. Shoes piled underneath a thin strip of carpet ran down the center, frayed at the edges. Through the patterned glass panes in the door, the blur of people walking past outside shifted back and forth. Nothing much happened there either. Someone came home, took shoes off, picked post up, went upstairs. Kids clattered through once or twice at night. It was just a dark strip with the occasional soft flash of headlights through the glass. I cannot explain why I watched that hallway as often as I did. There was something about the angle that made you feel as if you were balanced on a ledge above their doorway. It felt honest in a way. No music, no editing, just the light changing through the day. It became a quiet ritual, not every evening, but enough that I could tell when the doormat had been moved or another coat had been added. I started checking my own front door after watching, noticing how thin the wood felt, how you could almost picture a little camera in the corner above it. The first odd thing I saw there was so small I almost missed it. It was late on a Sunday with that steady drizzle that darkens everything without properly raining. I had the hallway feed open. The house was quiet, faint. Light from the street slipped through the frosted glass. Nothing moved. Then a darker shape passed close to the door, someone walking by outside. A couple of seconds later, the letterbox flap twitched. It lifted just a touch and fell back. No post dropped through. No flyers. It was not a full knock. More like someone testing it with a fingertip, seeing how easily it moved. I stared at that little rectangle of metal longer than made any sense. It could have been a bored kid, a drunk neighbor, a parcel courier playing with things on their route. Or it could have been exactly what it looked like. Someone touching the edge of that household safety to see if anyone noticed. After that, I started spotting tiny things in other feeds too. A back gate left open that was always shut before. A kitchen window tilted just enough that someone careful could get fingers under it. A side door that no one ever seemed to double lock. It was around then that I realized the page I was using was not the only layer. One evening, I accidentally scrolled past a list of locations and noticed a faint line at the bottom, almost the same color as the background. It mentioned alternative feeds, more active houses, and something about viewer suggestions. The text only stood out when the cursor passed over it. Part of me knew exactly what kind of people would click that link. Part of me had already become one. The new page looked the same as the first at a glance. Same list, same vague descriptions. But next to some of the locations, there was an extra column. In that column, short notes had been added in a neat little list. They were only a few words each. Gate, light, knock, back door. I scrolled until I found the hallway I knew. The description matched. Next to it was a chain of those blunt notes. The most recent said simply, letterbox. It did not take much imagination to connect that list of words with the little movements I had been watching. Someone, somewhere, was writing those notes after arranging for things to be done to that house people on the site had asked for small tests, and someone else had carried them out. Realizing that did not make me close the laptop. It should have. Instead, I shut that page and tried not to think about it for a bit. I lasted a few days. The feeling that something was now moving behind all those still images made my own flat feel thinner. One evening, after work, I came up the stairwell in my building, walked along the corridor, and slid my key into my front door. The lock turned with almost no resistance. It felt wrong immediately. I stood there, key still in hand, trying to remember whether I had definitely locked it that morning. You would be surprised how quickly memory bends when you need it to. Maybe I had been distracted. Maybe I'd been on my phone. People forget to lock doors all the time. I opened the door and stepped into my hallway. At first glance, everything looked normal. The shoes lined up in a half-hearted row. The little hook on the wall where my keys usually hung. A couple of letters on the floor. Beyond that, the living room in its usual state. Sofa sagging a bit in the middle. Television on its stand. Clutter on the coffee table. The kitchen to the right with washing up. I should have done the night before. Even so, the air felt unsettled, as if someone had been moving through it not long before I arrived. I walked through the flat trying to look casual, eyes sliding over surfaces, shelves, corners. I noticed a cushion on the sofa angled slightly differently. A glass on the worktop I thought I'd put in the sink. Tiny things that could have meant nothing. In the bedroom, the wardrobe door was open by a sliver. A shirt sleeve was caught in the gap. I always shut it fully, not because of monsters, just because I did not like the dark line of the opening staring at me when I was in bed. I pulled the door wide, half expecting something ridiculous. There was nothing inside but my clothes and a couple of boxes on the floor. Ordinary silent. I felt stupid standing there, listening to my own breathing. I told myself, again, that I was letting the things I'd been watching get into my head. That night I tried to keep away from the site, put on normal programs, scrolled news, anything. Eventually habit took over. I opened the darker page almost without noticing. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, I searched for a description that sounded like my own building. It did not take long to find. Top floor, city center, converted shop, single occupant. Beside it was the same kind of code I had seen by the hallway house. I clicked. My own hallway appeared in the little window. Same door, same cheap mat my mum had given me. Same skirting board scuffed where I had once knocked a bookcase. The camera was high up somewhere, just out of view. I had never installed anything. I had never agreed to anything. Yet there I was, walking in and out on old clips, completely unaware. The site kept a short buffer of footage. so I watched myself leave for work, come back with shopping, wander about half-dressed in the mornings, movements I would never do if I thought anyone was there to see them. Underneath the feed was a blank space where notes could go. The location was labeled active and new. No tasks listed yet. I shut the laptop so hard the lid bounced. There is a particular kind of fear that does not come with shouting or screaming. It just sits under your ribs and makes everything around you feel slightly wrong. My flat was suddenly not mine. It was a set someone else had dressed and wired for their own purposes. I found the first camera almost straight away after that, once I started looking. In the casing of the smoke alarm in the hallway. Another in a corner of the living room ceiling. Nothing obvious in the bedroom, but by then I assumed it was there, disguised as something else. I should have called the police that second. I should have rung the landlord and demanded answers. I did not do either. Instead, I scrolled down. At the bottom of the entry for my flat, there was that same faint line I had seen before. New locations eligible for introductory tasks. Suggestions open. Up until that moment, I had always thought of myself as separate from the people who use this site properly. I was a watcher, nothing more. Now the page was effectively asking if I wanted to prove to myself more than anyone how real it was. I can dress it up any way I like, but what I did next was stupid. I clicked to submit a suggestion. A simple little form appeared. My location code was already filled in. There was a box where you could type what you wanted done. No mention of who did it or how, no prices, no guarantees. I told myself I wanted a test, something small, something that could not hurt anyone, just to see whether this whole thing was live, or if I had stumbled onto some elaborate relic. I typed a short request asking whoever handled tasks to move one of the kitchen chairs a little out of place. Nothing threatening. Just enough for someone living there to notice. I submitted it before I could talk myself out of it. Nothing obvious happened. The form cleared. The feed of my hallway carried on showing stale footage. The word under the window stayed blank. I went to bed eventually, after checking every log and window twice. The next morning, as I walked into the kitchen, I smacked my hip on the corner of a chair that should not have been in the way. It was subtle. The chair was angled a few centimeters out from the table, as if someone had started to pull it out and then changed their mind, not shoved rudely, not overturned. Just wrong enough for your body to notice before your eyes did. I did not touch it for a full minute. I just stood there and stared at it. When I finally pulled up the site again, there was now a kitchen feed for my flat I had not noticed before. The recording from the early hours showed a dark room. After a few seconds, a hooded figure stepped into view. They did not act like a cartoon burglar. No creeping, no darting about. Calm movements. They walked to the table, rested a hand on the back of the nearest chair, shifted it slightly, looked at it for a second, and walked out again. The whole thing took less than half a minute. Under the hallway feed, in the blank note space, there was now one word: chair. Any shred of comfort I had taken from thinking of myself as only an observer disappeared. I had given someone a task, and they had completed it by entering my flat while I was asleep. I stopped submitting anything after that. I tried to pull back, delete bookmarks, go back to ordinary videos. I kept the laptop closed more often, but fear does not die neatly. It just changes shape. Every night I heard little noises in the building and found myself awake, listening. Every time I locked the door, I wondered who else had a key. I looked at the smoke alarm in the hallway and imagined the little camera lens behind the plastic. When I finally caved and opened the site again, there was a new note beneath my feed. Pending. No description of what was pending. No clue how big or small. That single word sat there under the image of my front door, and I could not stop looking at it. Sleep stopped being something that happened naturally. I would drift off, snap awake at the slightest creak, then stare at the ceiling for hours. I thought about staying with a friend, but every version of the story sounded insane when I tried to rehearse it. I did not want the questions that would come afterwards. On the fourth night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the feeling that something in the flat was different. No bang, no shout. Just that prickling awareness you get when you know there is someone else in the room even before you see them. I lay still and listened. From the hallway came the exact floorboard creak I had heard 100 times in other people's houses on that site. I did not shout. I did not leap out of bed. My hand reached for the laptop almost on reflex, as if it was the only tool I had. When the page loaded, my location was already open. In the hallway feed, a figure stood just inside the door. Dark hoodie, hands by their sides, head turned slightly as if listening to the flat. They were still enough that the only sign this was not just a frozen frame was a slow shift of weight. The little word beneath the feed flickered, then changed from pending to active. The figure moved out of the hallway, stepping under the camera and out of that frame. I cycled through the feeds with clumsy fingers until I got to the one placed high in the bedroom corner. On screen, I saw myself in bed with the laptop open, the glow lighting my face. A second later, at the edge of the frame, the hooded figure appeared in the doorway. There is no way to prepare yourself to watch your own fear from a slight delay. I saw my shoulders tighten. I saw my eyes lift from the screen. I watched myself realize that the person I was watching was also watching me. The intruder moved with the same unhurried confidence as before. They walked around the bed, keeping their face just out of the camera's reach, as if they knew exactly where the lens sat. Their hand rested briefly on the bed frame. The mattress dipped under their weight. I felt that in real time while watching it happen, a heartbeat behind on the feed. That touch snapped something in my head. I was not an observer anymore. I was a subject. On screen, I saw myself slide off the opposite side of the bed, staying low. In real life, I was already doing it, driven entirely by instinct. My hand grabbed the keys from the bedside table. I moved around the foot of the bed and bolted for the hallway. The recording never showed the intruder speeding up. They did not lunge or chase. They just turned slightly, following my movement with a tilt of the head at the very edge of the frame. I wrenched the flat door open with more force than it needed and stumbled into the stairwell. The sudden change from the close bedroom air to the cold concrete corridor hit me hard. The motion sensor light came on with a tired buzz. I clattered down the stairs barefoot, half expecting a hand to land on the back of my neck at any moment. No one stopped me. Out on the street, the city was reduced to taxi headlights and the distant rumble of late buses. My breath fogged in the air. I stood there in shorts and a t-shirt, clutching my keys, and realized I could not walk back indoors on my own. I reported a break-in the next morning. I left out everything that would drag the conversation into places I did not want to go. I said I had woken to see someone in my room, that they had left while I escaped. Once the officers saw the altered smoke alarm and the discreet little devices in the corners, the mood shifted. They took it seriously. They photographed everything. They questioned the landlord. The landlord denied knowing anything about the cameras. They said the previous tenant had been quiet, worked odd hours, kept to himself. They promised to change the locks. The officers logged it as an unlawful entry with suspicious circumstances. Hidden surveillance, unknown installer. No one asked the right question. How did you know exactly when to run? I moved out within the week. Packed essentials, left furniture behind, argued about the deposit until I pointed out that it might not look great for them if I started telling people about covert cameras in their flats. They signed the form without further fuss. The new place was further out from the center. A second-floor flat in a relatively recent build with a proper security door downstairs and fresher paint on paper, safer in every way. I checked every smoke alarm, every vent, every odd fitting, holding my breath each time until I was sure no wires or lenses were hidden behind them. I also bought a new laptop. Part of it was practical. You need a computer for normal life these days. The other part was not practical at all. I wanted to see if that page still had my old flat listed, and if so, what it said. Finding the site again was easier than I expected. Muscle memory is good at carrying bad habits. The layout was almost unchanged. A longer list of vague descriptions. Some familiar, many new. The hallway house I had watched for months had gone no trace. Its notes and feed had been stripped out like it had never existed. I scrolled until I found the entry that matched my old place. Top floor, city center, converted shop, previous location. The feed window was empty grey now. Beneath it, the notes had been compressed into 3 words: chair, entry, reaction. That is what my involvement boiled down to in whatever log sat behind that page. A tiny sequence: chair, entry, reaction. Someone else's completed task. I was about to shut the laptop when a new line appeared at the bottom of the list. New location added. Under that was a description. Second floor flat, outer city, new build, single occupant. It could have been anyone. There are hundreds of flats like that around Birmingham. Thousands more across the country. On its own, the description meant nothing, but there was a little code beside it. When I hovered over it, a small note appeared, pending approval. I have not clicked it. I tell myself that not clicking keeps some kind of line intact. I live now in a strange version of vigilance. I tape over anything that looks remotely like a lens. I buy my own alarms and fit them myself. I unscrew covers from fittings that were never meant to be touched and shine a torch into the dark gaps behind them. I still wake at odd hours and listen for that particular creak of a board taking weight in the hallway. When it is silent, my mind fills in the rest. I picture my own front door framed in a grainy little window on a stranger's screen. I imagine them leaning forward slightly, the way I used to, waiting for something to happen. You can be cautious. You can cover your laptop camera and shred your post and avoid dodgy links. You can tell yourself you would never go poking around places online that people whisper about. That is all fine. The cameras in my old flat went up before I even knew the site existed. The feed was live before I ever tuned in. The person who shifted my chair and stood by my bed would have done the same in other houses before mine. They will do it in other houses afterwards. What I did, by watching and then asking for a harmless test, was give them permission to prove it to me. The last time I checked, that new entry still said pending approval. Maybe it has nothing to do with me. Maybe it is another single occupant in another anonymous building on the opposite side of the city, boiling pasta right now and checking their phone, unaware that someone has already filed them away under a code. Or maybe not. Either way, this is the part that matters to you. Next time you lock your front door for the night and walk down the hallway towards your bedroom, you might feel a faint pull to turn back and check it one more time. If you do not only think about keys and chains. Think about the simple fact that somewhere, out of sight, there are people who do not care who you are, only that your life can be summarized in a handful of blunt little words on a list. Chair, entry, reaction. At one point, I thought I was on the safe side of the screen, watching danger happen to other people far away. I am not convinced there is a safe side anymore. I used to think I was pretty good at staying out of trouble. Always handed assignments in on time, never got into fights, kept my head down and minded my own business. The sort of person teachers liked and parents approved of their kids hanging around with. That all changed when I started my second year at Leeds and got put in halls with Danny Morrison. Danny was one of those people who seemed to attract chaos wherever he went. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't violent or particularly reckless, just someone who always knew people who knew people, if you know what I mean. The type who could get you concert tickets when they were sold out, or help you find textbooks that had mysteriously fallen off the back of a lorry. I liked him well enough. He was funny, generous with his mates, and never pressured anyone to get involved with his various schemes. But living with someone means you inevitably get drawn into their world, even when you're trying to keep your distance from anything dodgy. It started small. Danny would get messages at weird hours, people calling him with requests for things that were hard to come by through normal channels. University accommodation with suspiciously short notice periods. Part-time jobs that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about work permits. Electronics that were significantly cheaper than high street prices, assuming you weren't fussy about receipts or warranties. Most of his business seemed to involve connecting people who needed things with people who could provide them. A middleman operation that kept him just far enough removed from anything obviously illegal, while still making enough money to afford better clothes and nights out than most students could manage. I tried to stay uninvolved, but when you're living on beans and toast while your flatmate is ordering takeaways every night, it's hard not to be curious about how his income stream actually worked. Danny eventually explained that he operated through what he called alternative marketplaces. Websites that functioned like normal classified ads, but were set up to handle transactions that mainstream platforms wouldn't touch. He insisted that nothing was seriously criminal. It was simply a way for people to buy and sell items without having to navigate the bureaucracy required by legitimate businesses. He showed me some of the sites he used, and they looked professional enough. Clean layouts, user ratings, even customer service contact forms. The main difference from normal classified sites was that they were hosted on hidden web addresses that you couldn't access through standard browsers. The products themselves seemed fairly mundane. Electronics, clothing, textbooks, household items, the sort of stuff you'd find on any second-hand marketplace. The prices were good, sometimes suspiciously good, but nothing that screamed stolen goods to anyone who wasn't looking too closely. Danny's role was essentially customer service and logistics. He'd identify people who were looking for specific items, connect them with sellers who could provide them, and handle the complicated bits of arranging payment and delivery, taking a small commission from each transaction while keeping buyers and sellers anonymous from each other. It seemed like a fairly harmless way to make money, helping students and young people who couldn't afford retail prices to find the things they needed. Danny was careful about who he worked with, avoided anything that was stolen or dangerous, and made sure his customers knew exactly what they were getting into. But as I got more familiar with how these marketplaces operated, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Some of the items being sold were clearly targeted at specific types of buyers. Electronics that had been modified in ways that served no obvious purpose except to make them harder to trace. Clothing and accessories that were described using terminology I didn't recognize, but that seemed to mean something specific to certain customers. More concerning were the services being offered alongside physical products. People's advertising skills and capabilities went well beyond simple buying and selling. Data recovery from damaged devices, document reproduction and verification, even what appeared to be identity verification services that could help people prove they were someone they weren't. Danny insisted that he stuck to straightforward retail transactions and didn't get involved with the more complicated services. But the boundaries seemed fluid, and I could see how easy it would be to gradually expand from selling second-hand electronics to helping people with more questionable requirements. The customer base was also more diverse than I'd initially realized. While many were obviously students and young people looking for bargains, there were also buyers who seemed to have serious money and very specific needs. People who were willing to pay premium prices for items that met particular requirements, even when cheaper alternatives were readily available. These higher-end customers often communicated through Danny, rather than dealing directly with sellers, apparently valuing the additional layer of anonymity he provided. They'd send detailed specifications for what they wanted, sometimes including technical requirements that seemed far more complex than anything a normal consumer would need. Danny started spending more time managing these premium customers, and I could see that the money involved was significantly larger than his usual transactions. Instead of making a few pounds commission on student textbooks, he was earning hundreds of pounds for arranging single transactions between serious buyers and specialized sellers. The work was also becoming more demanding. Premium customers expected rapid response times, detailed progress updates, and absolute discretion about their requirements. Danny found himself available at all hours, managing communications between people who operated in different time zones and had very specific ideas about how business should be conducted. But what really worried me was how paranoid he was becoming about security. Danny had always been reasonably careful about his online activities, using VPNs and avoiding leaving obvious traces of his marketplace involvement. But his security measures were becoming much more elaborate, suggesting that he was dealing with people who took anonymity very seriously indeed. He started using multiple phones, different laptops for different types of business, even separate internet connections that he paid for with cash, to avoid any link to his real identity. His room began to look like something from a spy film, with various devices and cables that seemed designed to make his online activities as untraceable as possible. When I asked why all this security was necessary for what he claimed was just second-hand retail, Danny explained that some of his customers were prominent people who couldn't afford to be associated with alternative marketplaces. Business executives, politicians, celebrities, people who needed to maintain public reputations but sometimes required access to products or services that weren't available through conventional channels. That explanation made sense up to a point, but it also raised questions about what exactly these prominent people were buying that required such elaborate secrecy. If it was just discounted electronics or designer clothing, why would they care about being associated with second-hand marketplaces? I started paying closer attention to the messages Danny received from his premium customers, trying to understand what kind of products and services were worth paying such high commission rates for. The requests were often vague, described in terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify what was actually wanted. Customers would ask for documentation packages or verification materials without specifying what these items were supposed to verify. They'd request consultation services or technical assessments without explaining what kind of expertise they needed. But occasionally, the requests were specific enough to be genuinely disturbing. People wanted detailed background information about individuals they claimed to be considering for business partnerships. Others requested access to private social media accounts or email addresses belonging to people they said were involved in legal disputes with them. Some customers wanted help acquiring items that belonged to specific individuals, providing addresses and descriptions that suggested they were planning targeted thefts. Danny insisted that he only handled the communications and logistics, never getting directly involved with whatever his customers actually did with the products or services they purchased. But it was becoming clear that some of these transactions were facilitating activities that went far beyond simple retail commerce. The most concerning development was when customers started requesting information about people in our local area. They'd provide names, addresses, and personal details about individuals living in Leeds, asking for verification services or background research that required someone with local knowledge and access. Danny began receiving requests to visit specific addresses, photograph particular properties, even gather information about people's daily routines and habits. These local reconnaissance requests paid extremely well, often several £100 for what appeared to be straightforward information gathering. But they also meant that Danny was now directly involved in activities that looked suspiciously like stalking or preparation for criminal activity. When I confronted him about this, Danny claimed that the information was being used for legitimate purposes: due diligence for business investments, background checks for potential employees, research for legal proceedings. But he admitted he had no way of verifying what his customers actually did with the intelligence he provided. More troubling was his acknowledgement that some of the people he'd been asked to investigate had subsequently experienced problems. Houses that had been burglarized, cars that had been vandalized, individuals who had received threatening messages or experienced identity theft. Danny insisted these were coincidences, that correlation didn't prove causation, and that he was just providing information that was probably available through other sources anyway. But the pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. I tried convincing him to stop taking the local reconnaissance requests, pointing out that he could be charged as an accessory if any of his customers used the information to commit serious crimes. But the money was too good, and Danny argued that someone else would just take the work if he turned it down. That's when I started documenting everything I could about his operations. I began keeping records of the customers he worked with, the types of requests he received, and their outcomes for people who had been investigated or targeted, building a file that might be useful if I ever needed to distance myself from his activities or provide evidence to authorities. What I discovered was that Danny's operation was much larger and more organized than he'd admitted. He wasn't just a freelance middleman handling occasional transactions. He was part of a network that specialized in providing intelligence and access services to clients who couldn't or wouldn't use legitimate channels. The network included people with skills in surveillance, data recovery, social engineering, and physical security. Customers could commission comprehensive investigations that included online research, physical reconnaissance, and even direct approach operations designed to extract information from targets. Danny's role was primarily handling local operations in the Leeds area, but he was connected to similar operatives in other cities who could provide coverage across the UK. The organization was sophisticated enough to handle complex multi-stage investigations that required coordination between different specialists and geographic regions. Most disturbing was the evidence that some customers were using these services to target vulnerable individuals for exploitation or harm, people in financial distress who could be manipulated into fraudulent schemes, elderly individuals whose personal information could be used for identity theft, young people who could be approached and recruited for various types of criminal activity. I realized that by living with Danny and keeping quiet about his operations, I was potentially complicit in facilitating serious crimes against innocent people. Even if I wasn't directly involved in gathering intelligence or providing services, my silence was enabling activities that were destroying other people's lives. But confronting Danny directly seemed increasingly dangerous. He'd become paranoid about security breaches and was constantly worried about being exposed by customers or competitors. Anyone who posed a threat to his operation was seen as a serious liability that needed to be dealt with. I started making plans to move out of our shared accommodation and distance myself from his activities entirely. But I also knew that simply walking away wouldn't protect me if Danny's customers decided I knew too much about their operations. The people he worked with had demonstrated their willingness to target individuals who posed threats to their interests. And as someone who'd been living with one of their operatives for months, I'd inevitably learn details about their methods and customers that could be damaging if disclosed to authorities. I was trapped between staying involved with activities I knew were harmful and trying to extract myself from a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. That's when Danny disappeared. I came back from lectures one afternoon to find his room completely cleared out, all his equipment gone. No note or explanation about where he'd gone or when he might be back. The only trace of his occupancy was a faint smell of cleaning products that suggested someone had worked very hard to remove any evidence of what had been happening in that room. I tried contacting him through the various phone numbers and email addresses I had, but they'd all been disconnected or abandoned. His social media accounts had been deleted. His university enrollment had been terminated, and none of our mutual friends had heard from him since the day he'd vanished. It was as if Danny Morrison had simply stopped existing. The university housing office eventually assigned me a new flatmate, a quiet engineering student who showed no interest in alternative marketplaces or questionable income streams. Life returned to something approaching normal, and I tried to convince myself that Danny's disappearance was just him moving on to better opportunities elsewhere. But I kept monitoring the hidden marketplaces where he'd operated, looking for signs that his network was still active in the Leeds area. What I found was that the services he'd provided were definitely continuing, but with different operatives handling local operations. New people were offering reconnaissance and intelligence services using the same terminology and methods that Danny had employed. The customer base seemed unchanged, and the types of requests being fulfilled were just as concerning as before. Someone had simply replaced Danny in the network's organizational structure, taking over his customer relationships and operational responsibilities without missing a beat. That suggested his disappearance hadn't been voluntary. Either he'd been eliminated because he'd become a security risk, or he'd been reassigned to different duties that required him to adopt a completely new identity. Either way, it meant that the people running this network were serious enough about operational security to make their own operatives disappear when necessary. And as someone who knew details about their methods and customers, I was probably next on their list of potential security risks that needed to be managed. I'm not sure if I should have called the police straight away, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? What happened was this. I came home to my flat to find a package that definitely wasn't mine sitting outside my door. Nothing unusual there. Happens all the time in student accommodation, where delivery drivers get confused about flat numbers and names. The label showed my address, but a completely different name. Someone called David Chen, who I'd never heard of. The package was from a medical supply company, which struck me as odd given that most students aren't ordering specialized medical equipment. But I figured maybe this David person had a condition that required particular supplies. and I'd just drop it round to wherever he actually lived once I worked out the correct address. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of just leaving it for the delivery company to sort out, I decided to have a quick look online to see if I could find contact details for the intended recipient. It might save everyone some hassle if I could arrange for him to collect the item directly. Searching for David Chen in Glasgow turned up nothing useful. Too common a name. But when I looked more closely at the return address on the package, I noticed it wasn't from any medical supply company I could find online. The address led to what appeared to be a generic business park with multiple tenants, none of whom seemed to be in the medical supply business. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging deeper into where this package might actually have come from. The more I searched, the more I found myself following links to increasingly obscure websites that seemed to exist in corners of the internet I'd never encountered before. Eventually, I ended up on sites that required specific access methods and weren't indexed by normal search engines. Places where medical supplies were being sold without the usual regulatory oversight and customer verification that legitimate companies would require. The supplies being offered weren't your typical pharmacy items. These were specialized medical devices, pharmaceutical compounds, and equipment that would normally require prescriptions or professional medical supervision to obtain legally. Most concerning was that many items were being marketed for uses that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. Substances described as useful for behavioral modification or compliance enhancement, devices that could be used for restraint or monitoring, even chemicals that seemed designed for incapacitating rather than treating people. I realized I might be holding a package containing materials that were intended for harming rather than helping someone. The medical supply company was a front for distributing items that could be used for assault, kidnapping, or worse. But that raised the question of who David Chen actually was, and why someone was having these materials delivered to an address near mine. Either he lived in the area and was involved in activities that required access to dangerous medical supplies, or someone was using a false name and approximate address to receive materials they couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. The package was heavier than I'd initially noticed, and when I shook it gently, I could hear what sounded like multiple small containers or vials moving around inside. This product is definitely not what you'd expect from normal medical supplies. I tried to research David Chen more systematically, looking through university records, local business directories, and social media to see if I could find anyone by that name who might legitimately be expecting medical deliveries. What I found instead were references to the same name being used in connection with various questionable online activities, forum posts about acquiring controlled substances, marketplace reviews for sellers of restricted items, even what appeared to be requests for services that couldn't be discussed on normal platforms. The name seemed to be a commonly used alias for people who needed to maintain anonymity while purchasing items or services that weren't available through legitimate channels. I was probably holding a package intended for someone involved in serious criminal activities, delivered to an address close enough to mine that they could collect it without being traced to their actual location. But I had no way of knowing whether the intended recipient was planning to use these materials against specific victims, or whether failing to deliver the package might prompt them to investigate what had happened to their order. If David Chen was expecting delivery of materials he planned to use for harming someone, discovering that his package had been intercepted might make him desperate enough to take risks to recover it. That could put me in danger if he decided I was a threat to his activities. On the other hand, if I delivered the package as intended, I'd be facilitating whatever crime he was planning to commit against innocent victims who had no idea they were being targeted. I decided the safest option was to dispose of the package without opening it or trying to return it to its intended recipient. If David Chen was involved in legitimate medical treatment, he could reorder his supplies through proper channels. If he was planning to harm someone, denying him access to these materials might prevent serious crimes. But getting rid of medical supplies safely required more thought than just throwing them in the bin. If the package contained controlled substances or hazardous materials, improper disposal could create environmental problems or give other people access to dangerous items. I tried to research proper disposal methods for unknown medical materials, but most guidance assumed you knew what substances you were dealing with and had obtained them legally in the first place. Eventually, I decided to take the package to the University Health Center and explain that I'd received someone else's medical delivery by mistake. They might be able to dispose of it safely or contact appropriate authorities if the contents appeared suspicious. But when I arrived at the health center, the staff seemed unusually interested in the package details and asked more questions than I'd expected about how I'd received it and what I knew about the intended recipient. Their reaction suggested they were familiar with packages containing questionable medical supplies and might have dealt with similar situations before. The health center staff seemed to have protocols for handling suspicious medical deliveries that weren't part of their normal patient care procedures. After providing detailed information about the package and signing several forms, I left thinking the situation was resolved. The health center would handle disposal appropriately, and I could forget about David Chen and whatever he'd been planning to do with his medical supplies. But that evening, I received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the medical supply company, asking about a delivery that had apparently gone missing from my address. They seemed to know specific details about the package and were very concerned about recovering their materials quickly. When I explained that I'd turned the package over to university authorities because it had been delivered to the wrong address, the caller became agitated and insisted that the materials were urgently needed for a legitimate medical emergency. They offered to arrange immediate collection from the health center and seemed willing to pay substantial compensation for any inconvenience I'd experienced due to the delivery error. The level of concern and urgency seemed excessive for a simple delivery mistake, especially from a company that was supposedly just sending routine medical supplies to a regular customer. I started to suspect that David Chen and the medical supply company were working together to recover materials that were much more valuable or dangerous than normal medical equipment. When I checked with the University Health Center the next day, they told me the package had already been collected by someone claiming to represent both the medical supply company and the intended recipient. The collection had happened within hours of my dropping it off, suggesting that David Chen and his associates had been monitoring the situation and were prepared to act quickly to recover their materials once they discovered where the package had ended up. But most disturbing was that the person who'd collected the package had provided detailed information about me, my name, course details, and home address, as proof that they were authorized to recover materials that had been mistakenly delivered to my location. They'd been watching me carefully enough to gather personal information that could be used to convince university staff that they had legitimate reasons for collecting the package I'd turned in. That meant David Chen and his associates now knew exactly who I was and where I lived, and they understood that I'd been curious enough about their activities to investigate the package rather than simply ignoring the delivery error. I'd gone from being an innocent bystander who'd received someone else's mail to being a person of interest for people who were involved in illegal medical supply distribution and potentially much more serious criminal activities. The package I'd tried to dispose of responsibly had instead led me into direct contact with people who now had reason to consider me either potential threat to their operations or a possible recruit for activities that required access to the specialized medical supplies they'd been trying to obtain. When I got home that night, there was another package waiting outside my door, this time addressed to me personally and containing a handwritten note thanking me for my assistance with the previous delivery and inviting me to participate in what was described as a lucrative opportunity for students who were interested in discrete medical supply logistics. You know how sometimes you lose touch with people and wonder what happened to them? Well, I found out what happened to my old flatmate, and I really wish I hadn't. I was trying to find someone who could make me a fake ID. Nothing serious, just something that would get me into pubs without having to carry my passport around Manchester. My real driving license had been stolen along with my wallet, and getting a replacement was taking weeks because of some bureaucratic nonsense with DVLA. Someone at uni had mentioned there were places online where you could get decent fake documents made. So I spent a few evenings browsing hidden sites that specialized in that sort of thing. Most were obvious scams, asking for hundreds of pounds up front. But eventually, I found what looked like a legitimate service run by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The site was simple but professional. Examples of their work, pricing for different types of documents, even customer reviews that seemed genuine. What caught my attention was that they offered to meet clients in person for document handovers, which seemed safer than trusting the post with something like a fake ID. The person running the operation called themselves Dockmaster and claimed to be based in the Northwest. When I sent an inquiry about getting a driving license made, they responded quickly with details about their process and pricing. About £80 for a basic fake that would pass casual inspection. More if you wanted something that could fool professional scrutiny. But it was the photograph on their profile page that made me do a double take. The image showed someone's hands holding a newly printed driving license, demonstrating the quality of their work. But I recognized the hands immediately. The scar across the knuckles from when Jake had punched the window during Freshers Week. The distinctive silver ring he always wore on his middle finger. Jake had been my flatmate for 8 months before he vanished. He was studying business at Manchester Met, was always short of money, and was constantly looking for ways to make quick cash without having to get a proper job. He'd tried everything from selling energy drinks at raves to offering essay writing services to international students. Then one day in February, he'd simply disappeared. Left his room exactly as it was, didn't take any clothes or personal belongings, just stopped coming home. His phone went straight to voicemail. His university login hadn't been used, and his bank account showed no activity after the day he vanished. I'd reported him missing after a week, but the police weren't particularly interested. Young men disappeared from shared accommodation all the time, they said. Usually it was drugs, or debt, or family problems they didn't want to discuss. Most of them turned up eventually, living rough, or staying with friends they hadn't told anyone about. But Jake hadn't seemed like someone who would run away from problems. He was actually quite sensible about money and relationships, never got involved with anything too risky or illegal. The sudden disappearance was completely out of character for someone who usually overthought every decision. Now I was looking at what appeared to be his hands in a photograph advertising illegal document services. Either he was alive and working as a forger, or someone else was using his identity to run a criminal operation. I decided to place an order with Dogmaster to see if I could learn more about who was really behind the service. I submitted my photograph and personal details, explaining that I needed the document quickly and was willing to meet in person to collect it. The response came back within hours, professional and businesslike. They could have the license ready within 3 days, and we could arrange to meet at a location in Manchester city centre. The handover would take place in a public area. They suggested the food court at the Arndale Centre during busy periods when there would be plenty of people around. What struck me was the writing style. The messages were formatted in exactly the same way Jake used to write emails, short paragraphs, specific punctuation habits, even the same tendency to over-explain simple instructions. If this wasn't Jake himself, it was someone who had studied his communication patterns very carefully. I agreed to the meeting and waited for further instructions about the exact time and location. Part of me hoped it would actually be Jake, that he'd somehow gotten involved with document forgery and would have a reasonable explanation for why he'd disappeared so suddenly. But another part of me worried that someone else was using his identity for reasons I didn't want to think about. The final message about the meeting contained details that convinced me this really was Jake. The suggested meeting point was a specific bench near the Waterstones in the Arndale Centre, the exact same spot where we'd arranged to meet during Freshers' Week when he was helping me find accommodation. Nobody else would have known that location was significant to us. But if Jake was alive and operating as a document forger, why hadn't he contacted any of his friends or family? Why had he left all his possessions behind and allowed people to think he might be dead? And how had he acquired the skills and equipment needed to produce professional quality fake documents? I started researching what was involved in document forgery, trying to understand what kind of operation Jake might have gotten himself involved with. It wasn't just a matter of having a good printer and some cardstock. Producing convincing fake IDs required specialized equipment, access to security features, and knowledge of exactly how legitimate documents were constructed. Such a setup would cost thousands of pounds and take months to establish properly. This was not something a cash-strapped student could assemble independently, even if he possessed the technical knowledge. That suggested Jake was working for someone else, possibly someone who had recruited him for his clean background and lack of obvious criminal connections. Young men without records were valuable for operations that needed to maintain a legitimate front while conducting illegal business. But it also raised darker possibilities. Maybe Jake hadn't chosen to disappear at all. Maybe he'd been recruited against his will, or coerced into participating through threats against his family or friends. The document forgery operation might be just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that used missing persons as expendable workers. I tried to investigate potential connections between missing person cases, specifically seeking young men who had vanished from university accommodation under comparable circumstances. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of cases across different cities, all involving students who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind personal belongings and active social lives. Most of these cases had received minimal police attention, classified as voluntary disappearances unless there was evidence of violence or coercion. The missing persons were usually described as having financial problems or academic struggles that might motivate them to start fresh elsewhere. But the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone was systematically targeting vulnerable students, making them disappear in ways that wouldn't trigger serious investigations, and at least some of them were probably being forced to work in illegal operations like the document forgery service I discovered. The day of the meeting arrived, and I positioned myself in the Arndale Centre early to observe the area around the designated meeting point. I wanted to see who showed up and whether they appeared to be working alone or as part of a larger group. At exactly the agreed time, someone approached the bench where we were supposed to meet. From a distance, it looked like Jake. Same height and build, similar clothing style, even the same way of walking that I'd observed during the months we'd shared accommodation. But when he got closer, I could see that something was wrong. His appearance was different in subtle ways. Hair cut shorter than he used to wear it, weight loss that made his face look gaunt, an overall demeanor that seemed more cautious and nervous than the confident person I remembered. Most disturbing was the way he kept checking his surroundings, constantly scanning the crowd as if he was expecting trouble or watching for specific people. This wasn't someone meeting a client for a routine business transaction. It was someone who felt threatened and was taking precautions against unknown dangers. I watched from across the food court as Jake waited for nearly 20 minutes, checking his phone repeatedly and growing increasingly agitated when nobody approached him. Eventually, he got up and walked away, moving quickly through the crowd toward one of the center's exits. I followed at a distance, trying to see where he was going without getting close enough to be noticed. He moved through the building like someone who knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned, taking routes that kept him out of direct surveillance as much as possible. Outside the Arndale Center, Jake headed toward the northern quarter, walking quickly and continuing to check behind him every few minutes. I stayed as far back as I could while keeping him in sight, but the streets were busy enough that following someone without being noticed was relatively easy. He led me to a small internet cafe on a side street, the kind of place that catered to people who needed anonymous online access. Through the window, I could see him settling at a computer terminal in the back corner, positioned so he could watch both the entrance and the street outside. I waited across the street for about an hour, watching the internet cafe and noting who else came and went. Most of the customers seemed to be using the place for legitimate purposes. Tourists checking email, students working on assignments, people who didn't have reliable internet access at home. But there were also a few individuals who behaved differently, using the computers for short periods and paying in cash before leaving quickly. People who seemed more concerned with anonymity than convenience, possibly conducting business they didn't want traced back to their normal internet connections. When Jake finally emerged from the internet cafe, he looked even more nervous than before. He spent several minutes standing in the doorway, scanning the street carefully before stepping outside. Then he walked quickly toward the tram station, moving like someone who needed to get away from the area as soon as possible. I decided not to follow him any further. If Jake was involved with people who made him this paranoid about surveillance, getting too close might put both of us in danger. Instead, I went into the internet cafe to see if I could learn anything about what he'd been doing during his visit. The manager was helpful when I explained that I was trying to locate a friend who might have been using their services. He couldn't provide specific details about what customers did online, but he confirmed that the person I described was a regular visitor who always paid cash and never stayed for more than an hour at a time. More interestingly, he mentioned that this customer always used the same computer terminal, the one in the back corner that Jake had chosen. That terminal was popular with people who valued privacy because it was positioned away from the main seating area and had additional software installed that provided better anonymity protection. This setup would be particularly useful for someone conducting illegal business online, such as running a document forgery service through dark web marketplaces. I tried contacting Dockmaster again through the original website, explaining that I'd been unable to attend the meeting due to unexpected circumstances. I asked if we could reschedule, hoping to get another chance to make contact with Jake in a safer environment. But this time, there was no response. The website remained active, still advertising document services and accepting new orders, but my messages to Dockmaster went unanswered. Either Jake had recognized me at the meeting, and realized his cover was blown, or something had happened to prevent him from continuing to operate the service. Over the next few weeks, I kept monitoring the website to see if there were any changes or updates. The service remained available, but the response times for customer inquiries became longer and more inconsistent. Eventually, new orders stopped being accepted entirely, and the site displayed a message saying the service was temporarily unavailable due to technical difficulties. I tried visiting the internet cafe again, hoping to catch Jake during one of his regular sessions, but the manager said he hadn't seen him since the day I'd followed him there. Either he'd found a different location for his online activities, or he'd stopped using the service entirely. The most disturbing possibility was that Jake's employers had discovered his identity had been compromised and had decided to eliminate the security risk. People involved in serious criminal operations didn't usually tolerate workers who attracted unwanted attention, especially when those workers were supposed to be untraceable missing persons. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but explaining how I'd found Jake would require admitting to browsing illegal websites and attempting to purchase forged documents. And without concrete evidence that he was being held against his will, they might not take the information seriously. People often assumed that young men who disappeared and later turned up working in illegal operations had chosen that path voluntarily. Proving coercion or trafficking would require more evidence than just recognizing someone's hands in a photograph on a criminal website. I started monitoring missing person databases more systematically, looking for other cases that might be connected to the document forgery operation or similar criminal services. What I found suggested that Jake's situation wasn't unique. There were dozens of young men who had disappeared from universities and later been spotted in circumstances that suggested involvement with illegal activities. However, the majority of these sightings were brief and inconclusive. People thought they'd seen missing persons in different cities, working in shops or restaurants, but the individuals had disappeared again before any contact could be made, as if someone was systematically moving them around to prevent them from being tracked down by friends or family. The document forgery website eventually went offline entirely, replaced by an error message claiming the domain had expired. But similar services continued to operate on other sites, offering the same types of illegal documents with the same professional quality and customer service standards. I sometimes wonder if Jake is still out there somewhere, working for people who use missing persons as expendable labor in criminal operations, whether he chose to disappear or was forced into it, and whether he has any way of escaping from whatever situation he's gotten trapped in. The worst part is knowing that there are probably dozens of other families wondering what happened to their missing sons and brothers, never realizing that their loved ones might be alive, but unable to make contact because they're being held by people who profit from making inconvenient individuals disappear. People who understand that a missing person presumed dead is much more valuable than a living person who might eventually find a way to ask for help. Okay, so I'll tell you what I know, and I'll try to tell it straight, which is harder than it sounds when you spend 22 years learning that the straight version is rarely the complete one. I was a detective sergeant with Police Scotland for over 2 decades, Lothian and Borders originally, then the merger, then a transfer to the Serious Crimes Unit in Glasgow that I'd wanted for years, and which turned out to be exactly as grinding as everyone warned me it would be, and exactly as necessary as I'd always believed. I retired at 51. Not pushed. I want to be clear about that, because people assume. My knees had been bad for years, and my marriage had been bad for longer, and I looked at the men around me who'd done 30 years and assessed what the 30 years had done to them, and I made a decision. I moved back to Edinburgh, where I grew up, and I rented a flat in Leith, and I took up running badly, and I did some consultancy work for a legal firm that wanted someone who knew how investigations actually worked, and I tried to become a person who slept through the night. That last part went fine, mostly, better than I'd expected. I'm telling you this so you understand what I brought to what happened. Not just the professional experience, the habits of mind, the specific way that 22 years of looking at the worst things people do to each other reshapes how you see everything. You stop being surprised mostly. You stop expecting people to behave as well as they're capable of behaving. That's not cynicism, or it's not only cynicism. It's pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is what eventually made me understand what I was looking at, about 6 weeks after I first stumbled onto it. 6 weeks. I keep coming back to that. 6 weeks of looking at something and not seeing it clearly. Me, someone who'd interviewed killers and built cases from nothing, and read crime scenes the way other people read books. 6 weeks. That should tell you something about how well it was constructed. It started with a favour for an old colleague. Helen, retired now herself, living up in Perthshire with her partner and her dogs, had been contacted by a woman whose adult son had gone missing 3 months earlier. The son, a man in his late 30s called Fraser, had been living in Dundee, working in logistics, separated from his wife. The wife had reported him missing. The police had investigated and found nothing that suggested anything other than a man who had chosen to leave his life, which does happen, and which is not a crime, and which therefore sits in a difficult position, investigation-wise. Helen knew the family distantly, friends of friends, and she rang me and asked if I'd take a quiet look. Nothing official, just see if anything didn't fit. I said yes because I had the time, and because I trusted Helen's instincts, and because the mother had apparently said something that Helen couldn't let go of. She'd said, Fraser wouldn't leave without telling me, not because they were unusually close, but because they had a specific arrangement. He rang her every Sunday, had done for years, and he'd never missed one without warning her first, not once. And then one Sunday, he just didn't ring, and he hasn't rung since, and the police said this was consistent with a man who had decided to walk away from his life. Maybe. It's consistent with other things too. I met the mother in a cafe in Perth, 60-odd, composed in the way that people are composed when they've been composed for so long that it's become structural rather than chosen. She talked about Fraser for an hour. I listened. I asked questions that probably seemed strange, about his routines, his money habits, whether he'd been sleeping differently, whether he'd been vague on the phone in the weeks before he disappeared. She answered all of them. At the end, she gave me a bag with Fraser's laptop in it. She'd been holding it since the police had returned it, hadn't opened it, wasn't sure why she hadn't. I took it back to Edinburgh on the train. Nothing on the laptop seemed wrong at first. I went through it carefully over 2 evenings. Browser history, downloads, deleted files recovered with a basic tool I'd used since my last few years in the job. He'd been a regular internet user without being a heavy one. News sites, football, a recipe site he'd visited with surprising regularity, which is one of those small human details that stays with you. Email unremarkable, social media minimal. He'd had accounts but barely used them. Last activity on most platforms several months before he disappeared. There was a folder of documents relating to his finances. I looked at those carefully because money is almost always relevant. His accounts were ordinary. He wasn't in serious debt. He wasn't, as far as I could tell, hiding money or receiving money from unusual sources. On the third evening, I found the forum. It was in a partition of the browser history that the basic recovery tool initially sorted into a miscellaneous category, URLs that didn't resolve to anything recognizable, accessed outside the pattern of his normal usage, always late at night, always between 11 and 2 in the morning. There were 9 visits over the course of about 5 weeks, ending 12 days before he disappeared. The URL was a string of characters that didn't correspond to any named site. I tried accessing it and got nothing. Whatever had been there was gone, or had moved, or required credentials I didn't have. What I could see was the cached content. Fragments, mostly. Text that had been stored temporarily on the machine and which the recovery tool had pulled back to the surface. I'm going to be honest with you. I've seen a lot of things in my working life. I've sat in rooms with people who'd done things to other people that I've never discussed outside those rooms and never will. I thought I had a reasonably stable upper limit on what could disturb me. The cached content revised that estimate. What I could reconstruct from the fragments was a community, a forum, organized around a specific category of content. The content was recordings, real recordings of real people being killed, shared and discussed among members of the forum with the engaged interest of a hobbyist community. Ratings, commentary, requests, ongoing threads about future content. The language was particular, technical, with its own vocabulary for describing what was shown in each recording and how it compared to previous ones. That part I could process. Horrible, but processable. I'd encountered material like this in my last years in the job, not often, but enough to have a framework for it. What I couldn't process, not immediately, was what I found in one of the fragments, a thread, dated 5 weeks before Fraser disappeared, discussing a planned recording, discussing, in the specific technical language of that community, a subject, male, late 30s, based in Dundee. I sat in my kitchen in Leith for a long time after that. The rain was doing what Edinburgh rain does in February, which is less falling than simply existing, a permanent damp atmosphere. I sat and I looked at what I had and I did what I was trained to do, which was to assess it without rushing to a conclusion. The description in the thread was not specific enough to be unambiguous. Male, late 30s, Dundee. That's a lot of people. It could be coincidence. Investigators who have been out of the job for a while sometimes see patterns that aren't there, connections their trained minds assemble from insufficient data. I was aware of that possibility. I held it alongside the other possibility, the one that was considerably worse. Then I looked at the date again. The thread was dated 5 weeks before Fraser disappeared. The last visit Fraser made to the forum was 12 days before he disappeared. The thread would have been active during his visits. He'd seen it. I need to stop here and tell you something that I've only admitted to one other person, which was my therapist, whom I started seeing about 4 months after all of this was over. When I understood that Fraser had seen the thread, had read on this screen, on this laptop I was holding on my kitchen table in Leith, a discussion of what was going to be done to him, my first response was not the analytical one. It was something closer to grief, a grief for a man I'd never met, for the specific horror of that knowledge, for the nights he must have spent between seeing the thread and disappearing, knowing what he knew, trying to decide what to do with it, because he had 12 days, and whatever he decided to do, he did it alone, because there's no record of him telling anyone, no email, no text, nothing to his mother, nothing to his estranged wife. 12 days of knowing and saying nothing. That's what I kept coming back to in the months after. Why he said nothing. Whether he tried to run and didn't manage it, or whether he froze, or whether there was something else going on that I still don't fully understand. I've turned it over, and I don't have a clean answer. People respond to extreme fear in ways that don't follow logical scripts. That's something 22 years taught me that's actually true. I gave everything to Police Scotland through a contact I still trusted. The laptop, the recovery, the cached fragments, all of it presented as clearly as I could manage, given that I'd obtained it through channels that were informal, to put it generously. My contact did what she could with it. There was an investigation. I was interviewed several times and gave the same account each time and was told on each occasion that the investigation was ongoing. Fraser has not been found. That's the part I still don't know how to sit with. He's still on the missing persons register. The forum is still being investigated. Or was the last time I was told anything, which was 8 months ago. The cached fragments were enough to establish that the forum existed and what it contained, but not enough to identify individuals or to confirm that the thread about the late 30s male from Dundee referred specifically to Fraser rather than someone else. There are 3 possible explanations. Fraser saw the thread and ran, and is living somewhere under a different name and is fine. Fraser saw the thread and ran, and didn't get far enough, or the thread described someone else. And Fraser's disappearance has an entirely separate explanation that nobody has found yet. I can assign rough probabilities to each of these explanations if I try, which I've stopped doing because it doesn't help, and I'm not sure the probabilities are meaningful anyway. What I know is this. A man rang his mother every Sunday for years. He stopped. Before he stopped, he visited a forum 9 times in 5 weeks, at night, and the last visit was 12 days before he disappeared. On that forum, there was a thread describing a planned recording involving someone matching his description. That's what I know. Everything else is inference, and I've been wrong before. And the cost of being wrong here is not inconsiderable. I still consult for the legal firm. I still run badly. I sleep through the night less than I used to, which is not what I expected retirement to bring, and which I'm managing, more or less. My knees are worse than ever. The habit I developed in 22 years of looking at a situation and asking what doesn't fit. I can't turn it off. I know that. It's not a switch. But I've learned slowly that there's a difference between applying that habit usefully and applying it in circles around the same set of facts until you've worn a groove in yourself that leads nowhere. Fraser's mother still rings Helen occasionally. She still doesn't know what I found on the laptop, or not the full version. We made a decision about that, Helen and I, that I'm still not certain was right. The edited version we gave her, that we'd found evidence Fraser had been involved in something online that the police were now investigating, was true as far as it went. Whether it went far enough is something I've discussed with a therapist and will not resolve here. I think about the recipe site, the one he visited regularly, more than you'd expect. I looked at it once, after everything. Just looked, just the site itself, not any specific page. It was a straightforward cooking website, nothing remarkable. He'd presumably been making meals from it, that's all. A man in his late 30s, living alone after a separation, teaching himself to cook properly. That detail should mean nothing in the context of everything else. It's the one I come back to most. I needed some extra money while I was at university, so I started tutoring kids online. At the time, it seemed harmless enough. Being a student in London meant living on about £20 a week after rent and bills. So when I saw an advert for online tutoring that paid £15 an hour, I jumped at it. I was studying English literature at King's College, decent enough grades, and I'd always been good at explaining things to people. It appeared to be an easy way for me to earn money while working from my cramped dorm room. The website looked professional, clean design, proper company registration details, even testimonials from parents talking about how much their children's grades had improved. They specialized in one-to-one tutoring for secondary school students who were struggling with English, history, and similar subjects. Nothing that required specialized qualifications, just patience and the ability to help teenagers understand their coursework. The application process was straightforward enough. I submitted my university details, uploaded copies of my A-level certificates, wrote a brief explanation of why I wanted to tutor students. Within a couple of days, I got an email saying I'd been accepted and could start taking on pupils immediately. The system worked through video calls scheduled at times that suited both the student and tutor. Parents would book sessions through the website, pay in advance, and the company would take a small commission while passing the majority of the fee directly to the tutor. Everything seemed legitimate and well organized. My first few students were exactly what I'd expected. Teenagers from middle-class families whose parents were worried about their GCSE results. Most of the students were pleasant, but they were having difficulties with essay writing and literary analysis. The sessions went well, and I started getting positive feedback from both students and their parents. But after a few weeks, I began noticing some odd things about the platform. The technical setup was more sophisticated than it needed to be for simple tutoring sessions. The video calling software had features I'd never seen before. Multiple camera angles, audio recording capabilities, even options for screen sharing that seemed designed for much more complex interactions than homework help. More concerning was the level of security around the sessions. Students and tutors were both required to use specific software that could only be downloaded from the company's website. The program included identity verification features that took photographs during each session, supposedly to ensure that the registered tutor was actually the person conducting the lesson. But the software also monitored much more than that. It tracked everything happening on my computer during sessions, which programs were running, what websites I had open, even how I was interacting with the tutoring platform. When I asked the support team about this, they said it was standard security practice to prevent fraud and ensure the quality of their educational services. The students I was assigned also seemed carefully selected in ways that didn't quite make sense for a random tutoring service. They were all roughly the same age, around 14 or 15, and came from similar backgrounds, well-spoken, articulate, from families that clearly had money, but weren't necessarily academic high achievers. What struck me as particularly odd was that none of them seemed to have friends or siblings who might also benefit from tutoring. Usually, if a service worked well for one child in a family, parents would recommend it to other families or sign up additional children. But every student I worked with appeared to be an only child from a household where tutoring was treated as a very private arrangement. The sessions themselves were also structured differently than I'd expected. Rather than focusing purely on academic subjects, there was always a significant amount of general conversation. Students were encouraged to talk about their daily routines, their family life, their interests and hobbies. The company's training materials emphasized the importance of building rapport and understanding each student's personal circumstances. Initially, I thought this was just good educational practice. Understanding a student's background helps you tailor your teaching approach. But gradually, I realized the conversations were following very specific patterns, with students being guided to reveal detailed information about their home lives, family relationships, and daily schedules. The company provided detailed session reports that tutors were required to complete after each lesson. These reports included not just academic progress, but comprehensive notes about what the student had discussed regarding their personal life, where they lived, what their parents did for work, what activities they participated in outside school, even details about family holidays and social events. When I questioned why this level of personal information was necessary for tutoring sessions, the company explained that they were building comprehensive learner profiles to help match students with the most suitable educational approaches. Understanding a child's complete circumstances allowed them to provide more effective support and identify potential barriers to academic success. But the more sessions I conducted, the more uncomfortable I became with the amount of personal information I was gathering about these teenagers. Some of them were incredibly open about details that seemed far too private to be relevant to their education. Family arguments, financial problems, even information about when their parents would be away from home. I started paying closer attention to the other tutors working for the platform, trying to understand whether they were having similar experiences. The company had a private discussion area where tutors could share teaching tips and support each other. But most of the conversations felt oddly scripted and superficial. When I tried asking direct questions about the personal information requirements or the unusual technical setup, other tutors either didn't respond or gave answers that sounded like they were reading from company training materials. Nobody seemed willing to discuss any concerns about the platform's practices or policies. That's when I started looking more carefully at the company itself. The business registration details were legitimate, but when I tried researching the company's history and background, I found very little information. They claimed to have been operating for several years and to work with hundreds of families, but there was almost no online presence beyond their official website. More troubling was the discovery that the company was registered as providing educational consulting and family support services, rather than simple tutoring. The business description suggested they offered much more comprehensive services than just academic support, including what they called youth development programs and family liaison services. When I searched for these broader service categories, I found connections to organizations that specialized in working with vulnerable young people. Some appeared to be legitimate charities and social services, but others were more difficult to categorize. Companies that offered intervention services and family mediation without clearly explaining what those services actually involved. The most disturbing discovery was that some of the families using the tutoring service weren't paying the fees themselves. Instead, payments were being made by third-party organizations that seemed to specialize in providing support to families going through difficult circumstances. Social services departments, family courts, and even seemingly private investigators were involved. I tried accessing some of the session recordings to review what information I'd actually been collecting from students. The company claimed that all sessions were recorded for quality assurance purposes, and tutors were supposed to be able to access their own recordings for professional development. But when I logged into the system, I discovered that the recordings contained much more than just the video calls I'd been conducting. The software had been capturing audio from my computer's microphone throughout entire sessions, including conversations I'd had with flatmates and phone calls I'd made while the tutoring program was running in the background. Even more concerning was evidence that the program had been accessing my computer's camera and microphone outside of scheduled tutoring sessions. There were recordings of me in my room when I thought I was completely private, captured during times when I hadn't been logged into the tutoring platform at all. The company had essentially turned every tutor's computer into a surveillance device, monitoring our personal lives as comprehensively as we were monitoring the students we were supposed to be helping. I immediately stopped conducting sessions and tried to uninstall the tutoring software from my computer. But the program had embedded itself much more deeply into my system than a simple application should have been able to do. Even after following the official uninstallation process, I could see that components of the software were still running and potentially still monitoring my activities. When I contacted the company to demand an explanation and request immediate termination of my account, I received an automated response explaining that tutors were required to give 30 days notice before ending their contracts. During this notice period, they would remain responsible for any students they'd been working with and would need to complete detailed handover reports for each pupil. The handover reports required comprehensive summaries of everything I'd learned about each student's personal circumstances, family background, and daily routine. Essentially, the company required me to compile detailed profiles for whoever would take over their educational support. I refused to complete the handover reports and demanded immediate account closure. But the company's response was much more threatening than I'd expected. They reminded me that I'd signed detailed contracts when joining their platform, including clauses about confidentiality and data protection responsibilities. More specifically, they pointed out that I now had access to sensitive information about multiple minors and their families. If this information was misused or disclosed inappropriately, there could be serious legal consequences for everyone involved. The company had a responsibility to ensure that all personal data collected through their platform was handled properly and securely. The implication was clear. If I tried to expose what I discovered about their operations, they would claim I was violating the privacy of the children I'd been tutoring. The families who trusted me with information about their personal lives could potentially take legal action if they discovered I'd been sharing details about their circumstances with unauthorized parties. I was trapped by the same surveillance system I'd been unknowingly helping to operate. I tried researching what had happened to other tutors who'd worked for the platform, looking for anyone who might have spoken publicly about similar experiences. But I could find almost no trace of former employees or any discussions about the company's practices beyond their official marketing materials. Either previous tutors had been convinced to stay quiet through similar threats, or something had happened to prevent them from sharing their experiences. The few references I could find to people who'd worked for the company suggested they'd simply moved on to other jobs without making any public statements about their time as tutors. The most disturbing possibility was that the tutoring service was just the visible front for a much larger operation, that the detailed personal information being gathered about students and their families was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with education. Young people from wealthy families would be valuable targets for various types of criminal activity: kidnapping, burglary, identity theft, or even more sophisticated fraud schemes that required detailed knowledge of family circumstances and routines. The company had found a way to systematically gather intelligence about potential victims while maintaining complete legitimacy. Parents were voluntarily paying for a service that gave strangers comprehensive access to their children and detailed information about their family lives. And the tutors, like me, were unknowingly collecting the information that made these families vulnerable to whatever the company's real clients had planned for them. I still don't know what happened to the students I was tutoring or whether their families ever realized what kind of information they'd been sharing. The tutoring platform is still operating, still recruiting new tutors and signing up new families who think they're just getting help with their children's education. But I've never been able to completely remove their surveillance software from my computer. Sometimes I catch glimpses of processes running that shouldn't be there, or notice that my microphone has been active when I haven't been using any applications that should require it. The company claimed they'd closed my account and deleted all associated data, but I suspect they're still monitoring my activities, making sure I don't try to warn potential victims or expose what I discovered about their operations. After all, I now know exactly how their system works and what kind of information they're really collecting. That makes me either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability, depending on whether they think I can be trusted to stay quiet. And given what I've learned about how they operate, I'm not sure which category is more frightening to be placed in. I didn't go on the dark web because I wanted anything illegal. I know that's what people assume, and I understand why, but that wasn't it. The truth is I was tired and embarrassed about what I was tired of, and I wanted to ask a question without it attaching itself to my real name forever. It felt reasonable at the time. There are things you don't want preserved as a permanent version of yourself. The place itself wasn't dramatic when it loaded. Everyone assumes that as soon as you access it, you see dead bodies or drugs or all kinds of unspeakable things, but it wasn't like that at all. It was mostly text, broken links, and abandoned pages. To be honest, it felt neglected rather than dangerous. Eventually, I found a forum that looked active enough. Plain layout, no images, just threads and timestamps. People talking about money, loneliness, family problems, ordinary things written carefully. I made a username without thinking about it and posted my question. It was personal, but not extreme. Something about my relationship that I couldn't ask anywhere else without people I knew seeing it. I closed everything down and made a cup of tea, expecting nothing to come of it. When I came back, there was already a reply. It was calm and thoughtful, which was a relief. What unsettled me was that it quoted a sentence I was certain I'd deleted before posting. I went back to check my message. The sentence wasn't there. I assumed I'd misremembered. That was the simplest explanation. I replied politely and left it alone. The next morning, there was a private message waiting. It said, "You didn't need to explain that part. I already knew what you meant." It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. The tone felt familiar, as though it was continuing a conversation I didn't remember having. I didn't reply and logged out. A few days later, I went back to the forum out of idle curiosity. There was another message from the same account. "You're not good at leaving things alone. That's why you're here." I blocked the account, annoyed more than frightened, and told myself that was the end of it. A week later, a message arrived from a different username, then another, and another. Different accounts, same tone. Sometimes the messages referenced drafts I'd never submitted, phrases that existed only briefly on my screen before I thought better of them. I kept telling myself there had to be a technical explanation, something I didn't understand about how the site worked. But that became harder to believe when one message arrived late one evening saying, "You always pause before you put the key in the lock. You look up first." I had never written that anywhere. That was just something I did, a habit I developed after watching too many crime documentaries. I stopped using the forum after that, but the messages followed me. My anonymous email began receiving parts of text that matched things I'd written privately and deleted. A half-finished paragraph from a document I'd started and abandoned. A sentence typed into my notes app and deleted minutes later. I changed passwords obsessively, enabled every security setting I could find, deleted the email account and created a new one. The messages arrived there too, within hours. After that, I stopped writing things down. No drafts, no notes, no half-formed thoughts on my phone. It sounds absurd, but it reached a point where typing felt like feeding something. The tone of the messages shifted. They became less curious and more assured. Less about what I'd already done, more about what I would do next. You'll go to the shop at 7:15 because you'll realize you have nothing for breakfast. I'd read messages like that 10 minutes beforehand, heart racing, trying to decide whether to obey or resist. Some nights I stayed in out of spite. Other nights I went anyway, because hunger and habit were stronger than fear. Either choice felt like losing. I began checking my inbox before making decisions the way people check the weather. I replayed my days looking for patterns, trying to work out how I'd made myself predictable. Gradually, my routine stopped feeling like choices at all. I thought about going to the police, but I couldn't imagine explaining it without sounding unwell. Someone sending anonymous messages from obscure forums isn't a story people take seriously unless it comes with something visible and violent, so I tried to solve it privately. I moved. I didn't go far, just across town to a different area, but I told almost no one the new address. I stayed off social media. I paid cash where I could. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. I slept again, cautiously, and started to believe I'd escaped whatever had latched onto me. Then a message arrived at the new email address. You unpacked the kitchen first because you can't stand not knowing where the mugs are. You left one box in the hallway because you liked the idea of leaving quickly. I sat on the kitchen floor staring at my phone because there was no explanation that made sense anymore. If this was digital, moving hadn't helped. If it was physical, moving hadn't helped either. The messages became more frequent after that, and more unsettling in how calmly they described my thinking. I'd begun second-guessing small things constantly, whether I'd locked the door, whether I'd closed a window, whether I'd actually done something, or just thought about doing it. I did look for cameras. Spent an entire afternoon checking every corner of my flat, every smoke detector, every electrical socket. Found nothing, which somehow made it worse. Then the messages started including other people. Your neighbor in 4B leaves for work at 7:40. She doesn't lock her door properly. The person you saw at the bus stop this morning will be there again tomorrow, same time. He noticed you noticing him. I started seeing the world the way the messages described it. Started noticing the same people in the same places. Started wondering if they were noticing me back. Started feeling watched in a way that had nothing to do with cameras. The message that finally made me understand came 3 months after I'd first posted that question. You think you're the only one I'm talking to? I'd assumed, stupidly, that this was personal, that whoever was doing this had fixated on me specifically for some reason. But that message made me realize it wasn't personal at all. It was systematic. I was just one of many people being watched. The forum wasn't a support space. It was a sorting mechanism. Post a question, reveal yourself, become interesting enough to track. I changed everything again. New email, new phone number, new flat in a different city entirely. Started over completely. And for almost 6 months, nothing happened. I began to think I'd finally escaped. Then one evening, I came home to find my door unlocked. Not broken into, not forced, just unlocked, as though I'd left it that way myself, though I knew I hadn't. Nothing was missing, nothing was moved, but there was something new. A piece of paper on my kitchen table, printed text, single sentence. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to become interesting. I moved out that night, stayed with a friend, didn't go back for my belongings for nearly a week. When I finally did, escorted by my friend who thought I was overreacting, everything looked normal. The note was gone, but my laptop was open. I'd left it closed. I was certain of that. I took it to someone who knew about these things, paid them to check it for malware, spyware, anything that might explain how someone had been reading my deleted drafts and tracking my movements. They found nothing, said the laptop was clean, said I was probably just stressed and imagining patterns that weren't there. I stopped trying to explain it to people after that. The messages have been less frequent since then, but they haven't stopped. They arrive every few weeks, sometimes months apart, always to whatever new email I'm using, always knowing details they shouldn't know. You still write things and delete them. You're reading this now wondering if I'll know. That last one arrived 2 days ago, the day after I started writing this account down, trying to make sense of it all, trying to create some kind of record that proves I'm not imagining this. I keep thinking there will be a final message, something that ends it or explains it or gives me a clear action to take. But I don't think that's how this works. Yesterday, I came home to find my door unlocked again. This time, there was no note. But my laptop was open to a document I'd been working on. This document, this account of everything that's happened. Except there were additions. Sentences I didn't write, inserted between my own words. Small changes to what I'd written, making it slightly different, more accurate, if I'm honest. I don't know if I'm supposed to be frightened or if this is just what happens now. I asked one private question in a place that promised anonymity, and instead of being answered, I was noticed. And being noticed, it turns out, means someone has a key to wherever you go. I'm going to post this somewhere public, not the dark web, somewhere normal, where it might actually matter, where someone might see it and understand. Though I suspect by the time anyone reads it, there will be changes I didn't make, additions I didn't write, because the messages aren't the worst part anymore. The worst part is knowing that someone can get in whenever they want, that they've been in, that they might be in now while I'm out, reading whatever I've written, leaving traces of themselves that I'll only notice later. That's what stays with me. Not the messages themselves, but what they represent. Not surveillance from a distance, but proximity. Not watching, but entering. I asked a question I was embarrassed about, and the answer, it turns out, is that some places don't just remember what you say, they remember where you live. About 2 years ago, when things weren't going particularly well in my life, someone suggested finding an online support group. It seemed like reasonable advice at the time. A way to connect with people dealing with similar issues, get some perspective from others who'd been through what I was going through. Nothing dramatic or unusual, just the kind of thing people do nowadays when they need help and don't quite know where else to turn. The group I eventually found seemed perfect, welcoming, supportive, full of people who understood exactly what I was dealing with. It felt genuine, like I'd stumbled across something really valuable during a difficult period. Looking back now, I suppose there were small things that should have made me question it. But when you're vulnerable and someone's offering understanding, you don't tend to look too closely at the details. And that's the problem really, because it wasn't a support group at all. It was a data collection operation targeting vulnerable people, and everything I shared there over 3 months, my fears, my routines, my personal struggles, was compiled into a profile that's been sold more times than I can count to people who see emotional vulnerability as something worth exploiting. I'm a pharmacy assistant working in Plymouth, been doing it for around 9 years now. It's steady work, dealing with prescriptions and customer queries. Nothing particularly stressful under normal circumstances. But 2 years ago, I went through a difficult divorce that left me struggling with anxiety and insomnia. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with my mind racing, unable to settle, feeling isolated and overwhelmed by changes in my life I hadn't chosen and couldn't control. My GP prescribed some medication for the anxiety and suggested counseling, which helped to a degree. But what I really wanted was to talk to people who'd been through similar experiences, who understood the specific challenges of rebuilding life after a marriage ends. Professional therapy felt formal and clinical. I wanted something more personal, more immediate, the kind of peer support that comes from shared experience rather than professional expertise. I found the group through a recommendation on a women's health website. It was called Moving Forward Together, described as a safe space for women recovering from relationship breakdowns. The website looked professional and compassionate, with testimonials from members who'd found comfort and practical advice through the community. There was a simple registration process requiring an email address and some basic information about your situation. Then you'd receive login details to access the private discussion area. I registered one evening when I couldn't sleep, filled out a form explaining I was recovering from divorce and struggling with anxiety and insomnia. Within hours, I received a welcome email with instructions for accessing the group's discussion platform. It was set up like a private social network, with message boards for different topics, member profiles, and direct messaging capabilities. The group seemed genuinely supportive. There were around 50 active members, all women apparently going through or recovering from relationship difficulties. They shared stories about their experiences, offered advice about practical matters like finances and childcare arrangements, provided emotional support during difficult moments. The tone was warm and understanding, exactly the kind of community I'd been hoping to find. I started participating regularly, posting about my struggles with anxiety and sleep, responding to others who were dealing with similar issues. People were kind and empathetic, sharing their own experiences and suggesting things that had helped them. One woman recommended specific relaxation techniques that she'd found useful. Another suggested herbal remedies that had helped her sleep. A third shared details about how she'd managed the financial challenges of living alone after years of shared expenses. The group felt safe enough that I found myself sharing quite personal information, details about my daily routine and how anxiety was affecting my work, specific fears about being alone that made me hypervigilant about home security, information about my financial situation and concerns about managing on a single income. The kind of vulnerable honesty that comes from feeling understood by people in similar circumstances. One aspect of the group that seemed particularly helpful was a feature called Accountability Partners. You could request to be matched with another member for more private one-to-one support, someone you'd check in with regularly to share progress and challenges. I was matched with a woman who called herself Sarah, who'd apparently been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and was now helping newer members navigate their own recovery. Sarah and I messaged frequently, sometimes daily. She asked detailed questions about my situation, always framing them as genuine interest in helping me work through challenges. What specific aspects of living alone made me most anxious? What times of day did I feel most vulnerable? Did I have family nearby who could provide support? What were my work hours like? And how did that affect my ability to manage household responsibilities alone? I answered all her questions honestly, grateful for someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding my situation. I told her about my morning routine and how I'd struggled to get motivated to leave for work, about coming home to an empty house in the evenings and feeling the absence of another person more acutely then, about lying awake at night, worrying about things I'd never worried about when I wasn't living alone, unusual sounds outside, whether doors and windows were properly secured, whether anyone knew I was by myself. Sarah would respond with understanding and practical advice. She'd share similar experiences from her own recovery, suggest specific strategies for managing anxiety, ask follow-up questions that showed she was really listening and thinking about my situation. It felt like genuine friendship developing, the kind of connection that helps you feel less alone during difficult times. After about 3 months of active participation in the group, I started feeling better. The anxiety was more manageable, I was sleeping more consistently, and life as a single person was becoming normal rather than frightening. I participated less frequently in the group discussions, not because I was unhappy with the community, but because I simply needed it less. I check in occasionally, but mostly I was moving forward with my life, which was the entire point. Then, about 6 months after I'd largely stopped participating, I received an email from someone claiming to be a journalist investigating online support groups. She explained that she'd found evidence that moving forward together wasn't what it appeared to be, and she was trying to contact former members to warn them about what their personal information might have been used for. I was skeptical at first, thinking it might be spam or some kind of scam, but the journalist provided specific details about the group that convinced me she was legitimate. She explained that moving forward together was operated by people who specialized in gathering detailed personal information from vulnerable individuals, information that could be used for various forms of exploitation, including targeted fraud, stalking, and burglary. She discovered this whilst investigating a series of burglaries targeting single women, all of whom had at some point participated in online support groups for relationship recovery. The pattern had been subtle enough that police hadn't initially connected the cases, but the journalist had noticed similarities in how the victims had been selected and the timing of when they were targeted. The journalist had managed to gain access to back-end systems used by the people running Moving Forward Together, and what she found was disturbing. The group wasn't a genuine support community. It was a sophisticated information-gathering operation designed to extract detailed personal information from emotionally vulnerable women under the guise of peer support and friendship. Every post made in the group was being analyzed and compiled into individual member profiles. The direct messages, the accountability partnerships, the private conversations where members shared their most vulnerable moments, all of it was being recorded and organized into comprehensive dossiers about each participant's life, fears, routines, and circumstances. My profile included everything I'd shared over those 3 months, my work schedule at the pharmacy and typical routines, my home address, which I'd mentioned in context of discussing my neighborhood and feeling isolated there, detailed information about my anxiety triggers and specific fears about living alone, notes about my financial situation and what valuables I owned, even analysis of my sleeping patterns and what times I was most likely to be home versus away. But the profile also included information I'd never shared directly, analysis based on what I'd written, inferences about my psychology and behavior, assessments of my vulnerability to different types of exploitation, notes indicating I was particularly susceptible to authority figures and likely to comply with demands from people presenting themselves as official or helpful, observations about my tendency to trust people who seemed understanding and supportive. The journalist showed me screenshots of the dark web marketplace where these profiles were being sold. It was organized like a database of vulnerable targets, searchable by location, living situation, specific vulnerabilities, and types of exploitable information available. My profile was listed under single women in the Plymouth area with documented anxiety and security concerns. The listing emphasized the quality and detail of information available. It highlighted that I'd willingly shared intimate details about my fears and routines. that I'd been open about my financial situation and possessions, that I'd documented specific times when I was home alone and feeling most vulnerable. All of this was presented as valuable intelligence for anyone interested in targeting me for fraud, burglary, stalking, or other forms of exploitation. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 8 different accounts over the past 18 months. 8 separate people or organizations had paid money for comprehensive information about my personal life, my vulnerabilities, my routines, my fears. The marketplace didn't reveal buyer identities, but the journalist had been working with police to try to trace some transactions and identify who was purchasing these profiles. What made it particularly insidious was how the information had been gathered. I hadn't been tricked into sharing personal details through obvious phishing or fraud. I'd voluntarily provided everything, believing I was participating in a genuine support community, trusting that my vulnerability would be met with compassion rather than exploitation. The entire operation was built on weaponizing the instinct to seek help and connection during difficult times. The journalist had identified around 200 women whose profiles were being sold through the same marketplace, all of them having participated in various online support groups operated by the same organization. Groups for relationship recovery, bereavement support, health anxiety, financial stress. Any community where people were likely to share detailed personal information while seeking help and understanding. Several women whose profiles had been purchased had subsequently been victims of crimes. Burglaries timed to occur when they were reliably away from home. Sophisticated fraud attempts targeting their specific financial vulnerabilities. Stalking by individuals who'd used the profiles to learn their routines and locations. The journalist had documented around 15 cases where profile purchases correlated clearly with subsequent victimization. I contacted the police after speaking with the journalist. They were already investigating the operation based on information she'd provided, and they took detailed statements from me about my participation in the group and what I'd shared. They explained that prosecuting these cases was complicated because the information had been voluntarily provided. Even though the context was deceptive, the act of compiling and selling the information might be illegal, but proving that members had been deliberately deceived required demonstrating the group's true purpose. A detective showed me more details about how the operation worked. The people running it had created dozens of different support groups covering various life challenges. Each group appeared independent, with different branding and website designs, but they were all operated by the same organization, collecting information for the same marketplace. The accountability partnership feature was particularly calculated, pairing vulnerable members with supposed peers who were actually employees, trained to extract specific types of information through empathetic conversation. Sarah, my accountability partner, wasn't a real member who'd recovered from divorce. She was someone employed to build trust with me and systematically gather details about my life that could be valuable to potential buyers. The detective walked me through evidence they'd gathered about Sarah specifically. Her real name was something else entirely, and she'd been matched with around 40 different women across various support groups, always playing the role of recovered peer offering help to newer members. She had scripts for different scenarios, guidelines for what information to prioritize, training in how to build trust and encourage vulnerable disclosure. Learning that those months of what felt like genuine friendship had been calculated, manipulation was devastating in a way that's difficult to articulate. Sarah's empathy had been performance, her understanding had been strategic, and every vulnerable thing I'd shared with her had been recorded and packaged for sale to strangers who viewed my emotional struggles as exploitable weaknesses. The police investigation eventually led to arrests of several people involved in operating the support groups and marketplace. But the profiles themselves had already been widely distributed. My information, along with hundreds of other women's detailed personal disclosures, existed in private collections of people who downloaded them before law enforcement shut down the marketplace. I had to make significant changes to my life to feel even marginally safe after discovering this. I moved to a different area within Plymouth, stopped using my previous routines, closed down most of my social media presence. I'm hypervigilant about what information I share online now, even in contexts that seem genuinely helpful and supportive. The experience has made me deeply suspicious of online communities and reluctant to seek help even when I need it. What haunts me most is thinking about the 8 unknown buyers who purchased my profile. Who were they? Why were they interested in detailed information about me specifically? What did they plan to do with knowledge of my fears and routines? The journalist and police identified connections to some crimes, but most buyers remained untraced, their intentions unknown, their continued interest in my information impossible to assess. I also think about the other women whose profiles were sold through that marketplace. How many of them still don't know what happened, still believe they participated in genuine support groups, still trust that their vulnerable disclosures were held in confidence by compassionate peers? The journalist contacted everyone she could identify, but there were gaps in member information, and many women who'd used pseudonyms that couldn't be traced to real identities. The psychological impact has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. I struggle to trust people now, particularly when they seem understanding or supportive. I question whether kindness is genuine or calculated, whether people asking about my well-being actually care, or are gathering information for purposes I don't understand. The suspicion affects my relationships and makes it difficult to accept help even from people who genuinely want to provide it. I joined that support group looking for help during a difficult time in my life. I shared my fears, my struggles, my vulnerable moments, believing I was participating in a community of mutual support and understanding. Instead, I was providing detailed intelligence that was compiled, analyzed, and sold to people who viewed my emotional vulnerability as exploitable weakness. That's what I think about now when I see online support groups advertised. Not whether they're genuinely helpful or moderated by caring people, but whether they're information gathering operations targeting vulnerable individuals. Whether the supportive responses and empathetic questions are genuine or strategic, designed to extract valuable personal details that can be packaged and sold to buyers with malicious intent. The profiles exist. The violation is permanent. And somewhere, 8 different people or organizations possess comprehensive information about my life during my most vulnerable period. Information I shared voluntarily, believing I was seeking help from people who understood my struggles. That knowledge has changed how I navigate the world, making me cautious where I used to be trusting, suspicious where I used to be open, isolated where I used to seek connection. I sought help when I was struggling, and that decision to reach out left me permanently compromised. My vulnerability was weaponized, my trust was exploited, and my most private struggles were converted into a product sold to strangers whose interest in me is anything but compassionate. That's the price I paid for trying to find support during a difficult time, and it's a price I'll be paying for the rest of my life. The text message was clearly meant for someone else, but when I tried to let them know they'd sent it to the wrong person, I discovered they already knew exactly who I was. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for lectures at Birmingham University. a simple message with just an address in Moseley and a time, 3 p.m. today. Nothing else. No context, no name, no explanation of what was supposed to happen at that location. I assumed it was a scheduling mix-up, someone trying to arrange a meeting or delivery who'd mistyped a phone number. Happens all the time, especially with university students constantly sharing contact details for group projects and social arrangements. I sent back a quick reply explaining that they'd reached the wrong person and might want to check their contact list. Simple courtesy that would hopefully ensure their actual intended recipient got the message they needed. The response came within minutes, and it made my stomach drop. Instead of acknowledging the mistake, they sent back a message that included my full name, my university course details, and my home address in student accommodation. Information that a random wrong number shouldn't have had any way of knowing. When I asked how they knew my personal details, the response was even more unsettling. They claimed we'd been in contact before and seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't remember our previous conversations. They referenced specific topics we'd supposedly discussed and mentioned arrangements we'd apparently made for ongoing communication. But I had no memory of any previous contact with this number, and the conversations they described didn't match anything I'd actually participated in. Either they were confusing me with someone else, or something much stranger was happening. I decided to check my phone's message history more carefully, looking for any previous contact with that number that I might have forgotten. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of messages between my phone and theirs, dating back several weeks, showing conversations that I was certain I'd never had. The message threads showed me apparently agreeing to meet with this person, sharing personal information about my daily routine, and even discussing plans for activities that I would never have consented to participate in. But I had no memory of sending any of these messages or having any of these conversations. Either someone else had been using my phone, or the message history had been fabricated in some way that made it appear I'd been in regular contact with a complete stranger. When I tried to call the number to demand an explanation, it went straight to a voicemail system that didn't identify the account holder. The recorded message was generic and professional, giving no indication of who might be behind the mysterious communications. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the message history, records of when I'd supposedly sent messages that I didn't remember writing, even details about the conversations that had apparently taken place without my knowledge or participation. The pattern suggested that someone had been impersonating me through my own phone, conducting conversations and making arrangements as if they were me, while somehow preventing me from being aware of this activity. But the technical explanation for how this could happen was unclear. Unless someone had physical access to my phone, it should have been impossible for them to send messages from my number without my knowledge. I tried researching whether phones could be compromised in ways that would allow remote access to messaging functions, and found that sophisticated malware could potentially provide that level of control over someone's device. If my phone had been infected with surveillance software, someone could potentially monitor my activities, access my contacts and personal information, and even send messages that appeared to come from me while keeping me unaware of their activities. The realization that my phone might be completely compromised was terrifying. If someone had that level of access to my device, they could potentially monitor everything I did, every conversation, every location I visited, every piece of personal information I stored or accessed. But proving that my phone had been compromised would require technical expertise I didn't possess, and explaining the situation to university IT support or police would involve admitting that I'd been having mysterious conversations with unknown individuals about topics I couldn't remember discussing. Meanwhile, the messages from the mysterious contact continued arriving, with increasingly specific references to plans and arrangements that I supposedly knew about but had no actual knowledge of. They mentioned meeting locations around Birmingham, times when I was apparently expected to be available, and even payments for services that I'd supposedly agreed to provide. All presented as if these were normal ongoing arrangements that I should obviously remember and honor. When I tried to refuse to participate in whatever activities they thought I'd agreed to, they seemed genuinely confused and concerned about my apparent memory problems. They offered to provide documentation of our previous agreements and suggested that I might need medical attention if I was experiencing serious memory loss. The gaslighting aspect of the situation was almost as disturbing as the technical violation. Someone was systematically making me question my own memory and sanity while maintaining the pretense that our interaction was completely normal and consensual. But the most troubling development was when they started providing evidence of the arrangements I'd supposedly made. Photographs that appeared to show me in locations I didn't remember visiting. Documents that seemed to bear my signature on agreements I'd never seen before. Even financial records showing payments made from accounts in my name. Either I was experiencing serious memory problems that were affecting my ability to recall significant portions of my recent life, or someone had created comprehensive fake evidence of activities and agreements that had never actually occurred. The sophistication required to fabricate such detailed false documentation suggested this wasn't a simple prank or misunderstanding. Someone had invested significant resources into creating a false history of interactions and arrangements that could be used to manipulate me into participating in activities I would never have agreed to voluntarily. I tried to research whether other people had experienced similar situations. Mysterious communications claiming previous contact and arrangements that the recipients had no memory of making. What I found were scattered reports of people who discovered they were apparently participating in activities they had no knowledge of, with comprehensive documentation proving their involvement in arrangements they couldn't remember agreeing to. Most victims initially assumed they were experiencing memory problems or psychological issues, but investigation eventually revealed that they'd been targeted by sophisticated manipulation operations that used technical compromise and false documentation to create fake histories of consent and agreement. The operations were designed to make targets question their own memory and judgment, while gradually drawing them into activities that became increasingly difficult to escape from or explain to others. But proving that the false documentation was fabricated required technical and legal expertise that most individuals couldn't access, especially when the fake evidence appeared professionally created and legally valid. Meanwhile, the people behind these operations could continue manipulating their targets while maintaining plausible deniability about coercion or fraud. Since the victims appeared to have willingly participated in all documented activities, I realized that I was probably being targeted for recruitment into some form of illegal activity, with the mysterious contact and false communication history being used to establish a foundation of apparent consent that could be used to justify increasingly serious demands. But extricating myself from the situation would be complicated by the fake evidence suggesting I'd already agreed to participate in activities I knew nothing about. Simply denying involvement would make me appear unreliable or dishonest, especially if the false documentation was professionally convincing. The safest approach seemed to be compliance with whatever minor initial requests they made, while gathering evidence that might eventually prove the fraudulent nature of the supposed agreements and arrangements. But each small compliance would provide additional material for creating more comprehensive fake documentation of my voluntary participation, making it even harder to prove coercion if the demands escalated to obviously illegal activities. I was trapped between immediate compliance and long-term manipulation, with no clear way to escape from a situation that had been designed to become progressively more difficult to resist or expose. When my phone rang at exactly the time and date mentioned in that first mysterious text message, the caller ID showed my own number calling me. Picture a scenario where you've worked somewhere for 8 years, put in the overtime, covered for colleagues when they called in sick, never missed a deadline, and then one Tuesday morning, your manager calls you into his office and tells you the company is restructuring. Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and they'll post your belongings within a week. That's what happened to me 3 months ago. My name is Martin, I'm 42, and until recently, I was a project coordinator at a logistics company in Reading. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was good at it. The manager who fired me was a man called David Henley, someone who'd been brought in 6 months earlier to implement cost-cutting measures. He'd barely spoken to me before that Tuesday, but he delivered the news with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he'd done this many times before. What made it worse was that I knew the restructuring was selective. 3 people from my department were let go, but they kept on 2 others who did essentially the same work, just less efficiently. The decision seemed arbitrary, personal even, though I couldn't understand what I might have done to warrant being singled out. The first few weeks after losing the job were occupied with practical concerns. Updating my CV, applying for positions, dealing with benefits paperwork, explaining to friends and family why I was suddenly unemployed. But as the rejections started coming in and the savings began dwindling, the anger began building. Not just frustration at the job market or the economic situation, but genuine rage at David Henley specifically. I found myself thinking about him constantly, imagining confrontations where I'd tell him exactly what I thought of his management style, scenarios where he'd face consequences for his casual destruction of people's livelihoods. The fantasies became increasingly violent over time, though I told myself it was just a way of processing the stress and disappointment. Late one evening, after another day of fruitless job searching, I found myself researching David Henley online. Not for any specific purpose, just curiosity about the man who'd upended my life. His LinkedIn profile, company photos, mentions in trade publications. Nothing particularly revealing, but it felt like I was learning something useful about my enemy. The search led me to forums where people discussed workplace grievances and unfair dismissals. Most of the posts were routine complaints about bad managers and corporate policies, but some were more extreme. People talking about revenge fantasies, sharing stories about bosses who'd faced various misfortunes, discussing hypothetical scenarios that went well beyond anything I'd imagined. One forum in particular caught my attention. The discussions were coded and vague, but seemed to revolve around more serious forms of retaliation than just complaining online. Users would reference services and contacts in ways that suggested real-world consequences rather than just fantasy. The tone was matter-of-fact, practical, as if they were discussing hiring a tradesman rather than something far more serious. I started visiting that forum regularly, not posting anything myself, but reading through the discussions and trying to understand what was actually being offered. After several weeks of lurking, I received a private message from someone who'd noticed my browsing patterns. They didn't introduce themselves with any dramatic usernames or obvious criminal references, just someone called Mike, who seemed to understand what I might be looking for. The conversation that followed was surprisingly normal. Mike asked about my employment situation, my financial pressures, my feelings about the people responsible for my difficulties. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, offering practical advice about job searching alongside more pointed questions about my former manager. Sometimes he'd ask oddly personal things: how well I slept at night, whether I had family who worried about me, if I'd ever felt capable of crossing lines I wouldn't normally cross. I assumed it was just thorough customer service. Over several exchanges, Mike gradually introduced the idea that some workplace problems required more direct intervention than traditional legal channels could provide. He provided links to sites that looked like professional service directories, complete with user reviews and detailed pricing. The services range from relatively minor harassment to more permanent solutions. Everything was presented with corporate professionalism. No dramatic threats or criminal iconography, just matter-of-fact discussions of problems and solutions. The option I found myself considering was listed as executive adjustment services. The description was euphemistic but clear enough, and the reviews suggested genuine experience rather than imagination. The details felt just real enough, never specific enough to be incriminating. Mike seemed to sense my interest without me explicitly stating it. His messages became more focused on practical considerations, timelines, payment methods, information requirements for service providers. He spoke like someone managing a service contract, not arranging a crime. What made it feel legitimate was the systematic approach. They required detailed information about the target, including daily routines, security arrangements, and personal circumstances. The data collection process was thorough and professional, suggesting genuine operational capability rather than simple fraud or fantasy. I found myself gathering information about David Henley without quite admitting what I was planning to do with it. His home address, his car, his typical schedule, his family situation. The research felt purposeful and focused, giving me something constructive to do with the anger and frustration that had been building for months. The information gathering became increasingly detailed over time. I started following his routine, noting his lunch preferences, his gym schedule, his weekend activities. Not obviously stalking, just casual observation that helped me understand his patterns and vulnerabilities. The knowledge felt powerful, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had previously been entirely outside my influence. Mike's messages became more specific as I provided information. He would reference details I'd shared, suggest additional areas for research, and gradually build a comprehensive profile of David Henley's daily life. The collaboration felt professional and goal-oriented, like working on a legitimate project rather than planning something illegal. Around this time, I started noticing changes in my own circumstances that seemed oddly convenient. Job interviews for positions I didn't remember applying for. Meetings arranged by recruitment consultants I'd never contacted. Opportunities appearing with timing that felt deliberate. The interviews were for positions similar to my previous role, with companies that seemed legitimate enough. But the conversations would drift into uncomfortable territory. Questions about workplace stress, my thoughts on management accountability, whether I'd ever considered taking matters into my own hands when official channels failed. The interviewers seemed more interested in my emotional state than my professional qualifications. I began to wonder whether Mike's organization provided services beyond just executive adjustment, whether they were also involved in monitoring and managing clients, ensuring that people considering their services received appropriate guidance and support throughout the decision-making process. The job opportunities became more pressing over time. Offers for temporary positions that would require travel, consulting arrangements that would take me away from Reading for extended periods, opportunities that seemed designed to interrupt my research and planning activities. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Mike's messages became more urgent as well. He mentioned limited availability for executive adjustment services, suggested that delays might affect pricing or scheduling, emphasized the importance of making decisions quickly before opportunities disappeared. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. I arranged to meet Mike in person to finalize the arrangements, not at his suggestion, but because I wanted to confirm that I was dealing with legitimate professionals rather than elaborate scammers. The meeting was scheduled for a pub in central Reading, public enough to feel safe but private enough for sensitive discussion. Mike turned out to be exactly what I'd expected: middle-aged, professionally dressed, the sort of person you might encounter in any business context. But as we talked, I began to notice things that seemed inconsistent with the straightforward transaction I'd imagined. He seemed to know more about my personal circumstances than I'd shared in our online conversations, details about my financial situation, my housing arrangements, my social connections. When I asked direct questions about operational details, his answers became vague. He couldn't provide specific timelines, wouldn't explain methods, seemed reluctant to discuss practical aspects. Instead, he focused on my motivations. He wanted to understand why I felt David Henley deserved this level of intervention, whether I'd considered alternatives, how I planned to deal with the aftermath. The conversation felt more like a psychological evaluation than a business meeting. When I pressed for concrete commitments and timelines, Mike suggested that I needed more time to consider the decision properly. He recommended taking a few weeks to think through all the implications, perhaps exploring some of the job opportunities that had been appearing, reconsidering whether this level of intervention was really necessary. The meeting ended without any definitive arrangements being made. Mike gave me his contact details and suggested I should reach out when I was completely certain about proceeding. But something about his demeanor suggested that he expected me to change my mind rather than follow through with the original plan. Over the following days, I found myself questioning everything about the interaction. Whether Mike was actually connected to the services I thought I was purchasing, whether the whole setup was legitimate, whether I'd been dealing with professionals or something else entirely. By that point, the job offers had become more frequent and attractive. Legitimate positions with real companies, offering salaries that would resolve my financial difficulties immediately. Again, the timing felt too convenient, as if someone was actively working to provide alternatives to the executive adjustment services I'd been considering. I also started noticing that people seemed to recognize me more often. Once, a stranger mentioned the street I lived on in a casual conversation, though I didn't recall seeing him before. Another time, a shop assistant asked how my job search was going, though I'd never discussed it with anyone at that store. When I tried to contact Mike again, his account had been deactivated. The forums I'd been using showed error messages, and the service websites appeared to be under maintenance. All evidence of the executive adjustment option had become inaccessible. The job offers continued arriving though. Positions that seemed specifically designed for my skills and experience, with companies that had apparently heard good things about my work despite my recent unemployment, opportunities that would require relocation, keeping me busy and providing new focus for my attention. I accepted one of them eventually, a project coordination role with a company in Birmingham, better salary than my previous position, responsibilities that felt familiar and comfortable. The interview process was surprisingly brief, and they'd seemed eager to have me start as soon as possible. 3 weeks after starting the new job, I learned that David Henley had been found dead in his home. Apparent heart attack, no signs of foul play, nothing suspicious according to the police investigation. He was 45, no previous health problems, found by his wife when she returned from visiting her mother. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, but I had no way of determining whether his death was connected to my previous planning or simply random misfortune. I'd never completed any arrangements with Mike, never paid for any services, never provided final confirmation that I wanted to proceed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something larger than I'd understood, that my research and planning had been monitored and incorporated into activities I hadn't been aware of, that what I started had finished itself, with or without my permission. The new job kept me busy enough to avoid dwelling on questions I couldn't answer. My colleagues were friendly, my manager was supportive, and the work environment felt positive in ways my previous employment never had. Life improved substantially, making it easier to forget about the strange period of unemployment and planning. Sometimes I wonder if it all started long before I lost that job,